there's this feeling that I have that we're in right now in terms of what the brakes are. What are the things that could take us off the path to civil war? Because right now, I feel like we're already going at such tremendous pace and there's so much momentum. I'm always telling people in business, momentum matters. And there's so much momentum behind an idea that I think is fundamentally designed to disintegrate and to disunify everybody, that then the next question is, okay, well, what could counteract that force? And there's this thing where my wife and I will be in the middle of an argument, and I will actually call it out when it happens, where I'm like, we have reached that point now where it is impossible to avoid a fight. And I will say it out loud, Bret, in the middle of the argument. I will say, we have now reached that point, because you get so much momentum behind your positions that until the neurochemistry of that situation changes, you can't re-see commonality. You can't feel the desire to connect anymore. And if you don't feel the desire to connect, then you don't behave in a way that will draw you back together. And it is so surreal to me how you can feel that sort of click over moment where there is some sort of tipping point where now aggression and anger feeling is trumping the desire to hear new information, to sort of relax and remember that you love this person. Do you think that we've hit that tipping point? And if we have, is there something other than a fight that can back us off?
Well, I love your model, and I must say it mirrors the way Heather and I deal with things too, which is there's a recognition. I think for us, it's seated in our training as animal behaviorists, but there's a lot that goes on in human space that isn't really about the content, right? You think it's about the content because you're human and you're wired to process language because there's so much conveyed in it. But very frequently you'll understand an argument between people best if you turn down the sound so you can't hear what's being said and you just look at what's going on. And the same thing is, I think, true in the larger context, where we are watching a battle that is over very standard stuff, but it's full of very modern, particular content descriptions. The people who are engaged in it think that they're reacting to something much more specific rather than just the general frustration. So the way out, if there is one, does involve a recognition that you are being carried along by something, that you may have an objective and a focus, but that you are being carried along with a historical process. And if you can recognize what processes this looks like from the past, you'll know you don't want to go this direction. It doesn't end well. If enough of us can figure that out and manage to convey it, then maybe we can overcome the momentum, as you say. On the other hand, I think the odds are against us.
Yeah, I think that's terrifying. And I hate it when you speak so clearly and terrifyingly, because it is hard to argue. And on the streets, it feels it's unnerving. That is the word that I'll use. So when I have, from the perspective of trying to achieve things in my life, I have asked one question over and over and over, which is, all right, if Viktor Frankl is right and I can't control the stimulus, but I can control the response, even in the middle of a concentration camp. And that book was just absolutely transformational for me in terms of like, here is somebody who has lived through the worst atrocity that I can imagine and said, you can predict with like accuracy of 72 hours when somebody's going to die because you see them give up on why they are suffering. And he was like, if you understand there's that gap between stimulus and response and you hold on to that you can make radical change in your perspective or the way that you interpret things, which is going to then influence your behavior, which can, in his example, literally keep you alive or allow you to die. So I was like, okay, cool. I'm all for the deck. It may be stacked against anybody. Could be, maybe it's stacked against me. Maybe it's stacked against somebody else. Maybe that shifts and changes depending on the consequence or the context. But if I can, retain some of this control, then I can really get somewhere. And so looking at the world through that lens and coming to this sort of evolutionary understanding of things, as you begin to look at the movement that's happening now and what seems to be an innate feature, and I don't know if you'd call it a feature or a bug, but the madness of crowds and the that, oh God, I forget the exact quote. I'm sure you'll get really, really close. But madness is very uncommon in the individual and basically the default in crowds. And so what we have now is a crowd that is gaining momentum and it's moving in a direction, and getting other people to sort of step out of the stream and get the perspective on that of, okay, between stimulus and response, I have a responsibility and I can do something. And so partly because of you and like the things you were just saying, I had this moment when this all first kicked off, and I was like, I just want to put my head down. And dude, you can't imagine for the last, I mean, now it's been 20 years. For the last 20 years, all I've wanted to do is be the next Disney. I just want to make rad movies and TV shows and like inspire people and, like really bring something beautiful to the world. And I only want to tell one kind of story. You're not going to get a bunch of anti-hero stuff from me. Like I want to, my stated mission is no one should ever get to the age of 15 without encountering a growth mindset. And encountering it through story, because I saying it like we're saying it now, it hits people logically, but it doesn't hit them emotionally. We need narrative to drive down to the limbic level and really make change, do it at the age of imprinting. Like I've got this whole plan and I feel good about it. And then I'm like, okay, the thought of putting my head down in the hopes that the mob passes me by makes me feel like a coward. And since I know the punchline of life is exactly the following: how you feel about yourself when you're by yourself. It's all that matters. And I have run the experiment of, does wealth solve all of your problems? And wealth is awesome, but it does not solve all your problems. So I didn't want to feel like a coward. It made me step into that. Okay, well, what can I do at my own individual level to begin to tease this out? So because you're not somebody who's giving up. So even though you have a somewhat pessimistic view, can you walk us through the things that would have to be true, whether or not you think people are willing to do it? What are the things that would have to be true for this to stop shy of just outright conflict?
Well, I see a primary obstacle, which is that those who see the hazard clearly don't understand where the energy is coming from. And in some sense, we have to negotiate a settlement in a middle ground where the ability to navigate is being systematically disrupted by both sides. So you have, let's call it conservative for the moment. You've got conservatives who are dubious that the objections, that the frustration is real and is based on something that actually requires a remedy. And then you have the liberals, or I don't even want to call them liberals because this is so illiberal the way they're delivering it. But you have the self-defined leftists delivering a set of prescriptions that, as I've said many times before, doesn't seek to end oppression. It seeks to turn the tables of oppression, and worse, it seeks to turn the tables of imagined oppression so that it's not even being careful about its targeting. And what has to be the negotiated solution has to come in the form of a recognition that the system is rigged, and that it is rigged in a way that the misfortune is not evenly distributed. You can predict with a relatively high degree of certainty where the misfortune is going to be concentrated based on historical patterns of oppression. So
can you give me the very specific predictive mechanism you use? Is it zip code? Is it ethnicity? What is it?
Well, I would say zip code is by far the best because it does capture the fraction of it that tracks with ethnicity, but it doesn't limit it to that. And of course, it isn't limited to that. So what you really have is a kind of opportunity hoarding by what I call rent-seeking elites. Oftentimes, Go ahead.
I've heard you talk about that before. And one of the questions I want to ask you had said, because I have generated tremendous wealth in my life. And you said, a lot of people, so rent seeking being people that are sort of inserting themselves as money managers or finance people or whatever. They're not actually creating something. They're not adding value to the system, but they're extracting a ton of value, just as a quick thumbnail. But you said there are people. So I've always felt very good, right? Because I built a business from the ground up. We didn't raise outside capital and we turned it into something. And from that, I created wealth. And then you said, there are some people who create something with good intentions and then they turn into unknowingly rent-seeking elites. And I was like, shit, am I rent-seeking? So now I'm like, what is that next step? Because I have literally dedicated my entire adult life, and I'm sort of gambling with my fortune that I can create this narrative vehicle that will help some percentage of people encounter a growth mindset and improve their life. And my mission is to make it so your zip code is not predictive of your future success. But now I'm so paranoid that I'm doing some rent seeking that I don't even realize. So what does that look like? Like, is it just investing my money makes me rent seeking? What does that look like?
Yeah, you're definitely doing some rent seeking, but the good news is you're not doing it because of a defective character. You're doing it because of the way the market is structured and what rational behavior looks like. So, yeah,
so walk me through what that is.
Your investment portfolio is no doubt invested in things that, if you looked at the details of how they function, are just simply rent seeking. You probably don't even know. You probably are invested in some funds, and those funds, are picking and choosing equities and whatever it is, and those things are having an effect on, they're maybe you're invested in a company that makes clothing, and the company that was chosen for your portfolio is profitable. And why is it profitable? Because it's figured out some way to artificially depress the wages of the people who make the clothes so that when they get to the shop, they're cheaper and people buy them. So anyway, there's lots of places where you can be involved in rent seeking just by virtue of automatic processes in which you couldn't possibly be aware of all of the things that your money is doing while you're not paying attention. So there's that. And then there's also the issue, probably not for you, because I've heard very clearly what you've said here. Your objective is not only laudable, but it's also, I would say, maybe the important leverage point. You're talking about reaching young people. You're talking about reaching them with developmentally relevant, helpful stories that actually empower them. So my guess is net, you're in surplus. But does that mean that everything that you're doing is positive rather than negative in this calculation? It can't, right? For none of us. I'm sure I'm rent seeking too. I don't have a lot of investments, but enough that there's definitely going to be stuff hidden there. But the good news is you can't really be, if you were to try to figure out what effect you're having on the world in every detail, and you were to try to eliminate all of the negative stuff, it would take all your time and more. You wouldn't finish the job. So you'd be left ineffective in the stuff that you're doing that's positive without eliminating the negative stuff. So in some sense, I don't know if you're familiar with my personal responsibility vortex talk.
No, give it to me.
Well, the short answer is that game theoretically speaking, trying to live your principles in an economic context doesn't make sense. You will hobble yourself. You will end up in a cabin in the woods, trying to eke out a living without having negative impacts. And what that does is it reduces your influence on how society functions. So the world becomes more ruthless as you try to make sure that you're not doing anything that you don't see as positive relative to your values. You actually limit your influence over the system, and the system moves away from your values rather than towards them. So the question is, what is the best use of the power and leverage you have? And for you to be delivering narratives that empower individuals so that they know who they are better equipped to function, and making sure that that happens in a way that your zip code doesn't predict your success in life, that seems not only incredibly noble, but it also seems like the leverage point. And I fully agree with you. Conversations like this are all well and good. They don't move civilization, right? They can inform something that moves civilization, but the stuff that moves civilization is narrative. And so anyway, more power to you. I don't know how well that answers the question, but
no, it begins to pull at one thread of what feels like a very tightly wound ball of yarn. But I think this is, ultimately how it begins. So now getting into the thing that I always try to hold myself to is I only care about what has application in the real world. And so I'm trying to learn things, chase fascinations, whatever the case may be, that's actually going to make me more capable. So I'll give you a background or a base assumption. This is maybe a better way to say it. So if somebody asks me, what's the meaning of life? I have a very quick, aggressive, ready answer. I don't expect other people to agree. I think the biggest thing I want people to take away is it is possible to define that and then to act in accordance. So my definition is very simple. The meaning of life is to see how much of your potential you can translate into usable skill set. And that to me, and then you can, even take it one step further and say, and that skill set should be something that's unique to you, that you care deeply about, that you worked your ass off to acquire, and it helps not only yourself, but other people. Now, why do I think that's the meaning of life? Because that is, as far as I can tell, given that you are having a biological experience and your brain will kick up neurochemistry that either feels good or bad based on millions of years of evolution. So you're stuck in that there. Yes, you can transcend your biology, but you are in that biology, man. And so fulfillment to me is the name of the game, right? So fulfillment is often born out of really hard shit. It's doing hard things, right? It is not getting things just given to you. This is why I think the oppression Olympics is just destined to fail, because you're creating a frame of reference of victimhood, of I don't have agency. I don't know if Coleman Hughes came up with this, but he's certainly the person I heard say it. He was like, you're turning people into weather vanes and you're reducing the black population to, well, we're pointed in whatever direction the wind of the white man blows us in. And he was like, basically, fuck that. Don't put me in that box. I have agency. Like, I can do things in my own life. And so that to me is really where you should be focused, which is how you're going to feel about yourself when you're by yourself, which is a neurochemical experience, which is based on all the heuristics that the brain has worked into us. And in my interpretation of that, it's translating potential into skill set and then putting those skills to use.
Beautiful. That's lovely. And actually, to me, it seems like a key. It's half of a puzzle that I'm focused on. And I'm focused on the other half typically, but there's this interesting dynamic between conservatives and liberals, where conservatives see very clearly the personal responsibility part of the equation, and they oftentimes don't see the collective responsibility part, and liberals are exactly the inverse. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about actually the way these two pieces of the puzzle fit together, and it's a yin yang phenomenon. Before I get to it exactly, though, let me say the weather vaning. I have not heard Coleman say that, but I love it. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it. The way I think about it is learned helplessness. That in effect, this is just training people to be helpless because it results in rewards being delivered. And the end point of that is fairly clear. You're just going to create a helpless, needy population. And I mean, anybody who's raised kids or, even if you have nieces and nephews, you know how bad an idea this is, right? There's no way it's going to work at a civilization level.
And let me push on that and see if you agree why it's going to be bad. So the reason, as I hear you say that it seems self-evident to me that will become a problem is when you are a self-perceived, I don't think this is true, but when you've created a frame of reference, which we can get into why I'm so obsessed about frame of reference, but when you create a frame of reference that you are helpless and needy, think back to in any one human's evolution, not as a population. The point at which you are most needy and weak is when you're a child. And what is the mechanism that every child very quickly learns gets them what they want? A tantrum, right? You create so much like external pain and suffering that people want to calm you down by giving you the thing that you want. It's a strategy every one of us has tried and reaped tremendous benefits. And then we go out into the world and the world slaps us around and says, stop, you're obnoxious, I don't want to be around you, right? Jordan Peterson saying, don't let your kids do anything that makes you dislike them. I think that's a pretty good steering mechanism. But now, like when you talk about this horizontal movement, which is one of the more terrifying things that you say, meaning that this is already permeated everywhere. And so now you called it a sleeper cell recently. And I thought that was super apt and just way terrifying. And so you have all these people that have learned, hey, tantrums are very effective. And my entire identity is around how effectively I can use a tantrum to get what I want. My placement in the oppression Olympics, which I say with derision, right? Anybody listening can see that I think that that's ineffective. And I should state, I judge everything by whether or not what you're doing moves you towards your goal. And I judge your goal based on whether it will bring you fulfillment, right? So it's very easy to sort of guess how I will interpret something. So if you create that scenario where the only way to win is to throw a tantrum, we're doomed. And so is that or something like that what you meant when you say this just won't work?
Oh, exactly. And not only does it not work for the individuals, but ultimately they're going to tear down the entire structure, because a structure of people that gets what they need through effectively the kind of terrorism that children engage in against their parents, that structure isn't capable of producing anything. So exactly how is it going to survive in the world? And this actually brings me to the other half of the very eloquent personal responsibility portrayal that you delivered a couple minutes ago, which is, so you see the imperative as basically taking what assets you have and making sure you convert them at the maximum rate into capacity that's meaningful relative to your values, which I agree, absolutely. But the other thing is, I think we collectively have a responsibility to recognize that being a human being is an incredible experience, right? It's such a gift. And you could, if you were any other creature, the degree of that gift that you would have would be much less in the case of the next nearest creature, or none in the case of most creatures. And so we have this amazing opportunity.
We all live constantly connected to the internet and using it so much that we tend to forget just how dangerous of a place it can be. The reality is, every account you have, every time you input your name, your address, your phone number, you're risking your information being leaked on the dark web. It happens so often these days, it's become an inevitable risk of being on the internet. So protect yourself and your family online with today's sponsor, Aura. Aura provides all-in-one proactive protection to keep your information safe and secure online, stopping threats before they strike. From financial fraud protection, identity theft protection, parental controls, even spam call protection, and more. Aura has your back when it comes to you and your family's online security. So secure your digital life with proactive protection for your assets, identity, family, and tech across every device with Aura. Go to aura.com/impact theory to start your free 2-week trial today. That's aura.com/impact theory.
It seems to me that we have a moral imperative to deliver that opportunity to as many people as possible. And what that means is that actually we have an obligation to preserve this. This really isn't about our generation and whether we're satisfied or anything like that. This is about how long can we keep this running so the maximum number of human beings has that experience. And what's more, if you are hobbled by a cruddy educational system, if you are constrained by the requirement that you spend your time in a stupid job that has no meaning to you because it's the only way that you can afford a roof over your head and get your health care paid for and all of that, if that's what you're obligated to do, then we're squandering your human potential. And we should be seeking to liberate people as much as is humanly possible. So as many generations as can be, as liberated as possible, that seems to me our collective obligation. And how do you do that? Well, you have to enable people individually to take advantage of opportunities, to spot them. And it just so happens that these two things fit together rather perfectly. They describe what the objective of the whole exercise ought to be. So anyway, we're a long way from there. We have a system that just does not do this very effectively, but we can see it from here. And then this goes to the last part. We were talking about momentum, and we were talking about the danger of despair, effectively, recognizing that the likelihood of us fixing the problem is pretty small. But I always think of it in terms of being on a canoe or something, headed for a waterfall. At what point is the chance that you can paddle out of the path of the waterfall and get to shore before you go over so low that it's not worth your time? And the answer is there is no point at which it's so low, right? If there's any chance at all that you can get to shore, a fraction of a percent is enough. Giving up would be stupid if the result of giving up is that you go over the falls. So to me, this is where we are. I don't know how likely it is that we'll succeed, but I think the thing is, it just makes sense to take the best shot you've got. And sometimes you're surprised. You take the best shot you got and it's good enough. So what the hell else are we doing, right? Why would we invest in anything other than trying to right our course and avoid another tremendous calamity of history?
Yeah, that's very well said. And one of the things that I think will help us, in fact, one of the things I think that must happen if we're going to get enough people rowing in the right direction, is something that Heather, your wife, Dr. Heather Heying, brought up in one of your episodes. She read directly from the book Tribe. I have a rule: when you encounter something powerful, you should immediately go into it. So I literally, after hearing that quote, got the book, read it that day. And the punchline is, hey, boys and girls, like you have a two-party system, which is exactly as you just laid out, Bret. You've got people that err on the side of like this compassion, empathy, collective moral obligation to lift up as much of humanity as humanly possible. And then on the other side, you've got people who are about individual responsibility, not wanting to be taken advantage of. And I see a very it doesn't break on the same lines, but an equally important dichotomy in business, which is the visionary and the executor, often known as the COO, the operations person. And there is friction between the two in both cases. So you have friction between the compassionate people who want to help everybody and the people who are like, come on, personal responsibility, I don't want to be taken advantage of. And then in a business, you need somebody who's a visionary and is not worried about the consequences and just new ideas, crazy ideas, big ideas. And then you need somebody who's like, hey, motherfucker, you have to ground this in reality. And if we just spin off on all these crazy ideas, nothing will ever get done. And it's like, it was a huge breakthrough for me in business when I realized I'm a visionary. Because I live in it, I see it from that perspective. So again, my obsession with frame of reference. So as a visionary, my frame of reference is big ideas are how you end up building a big business and creating all the wealth for all the people, being able to pay people salaries and be generous and give them vacations and all that. I remember once looking out my window and there was like 20 cars in the parking lot and I thought, fuck, I've created something that has allowed everyone to pay for these. Like, that's crazy. Like, you're really helping people do rad shit in their lives. But until I had respect for the need for this other person to help me, right? And there's a great quote, I think it's John Ford, who said, or Henry Ford, who said, airplanes take off against the wind, not with it. And the example I hear in business a lot is you need both the kite and the string. The kite without the string just flies off into the ether. The string without the kite just lays on the ground. So once I said, okay, wait a second, this is exactly what's going on in our political discourse, is you have each side. Both sides are necessary. So if you're conservative and you have any temptation to alienate or hate the other side, like, you're missing the fundamental point. You are one half the equation. If it's just you, it slides towards tyranny. The other side, if you don't recognize that you need the other side, that it is the friction between the two, you said it perfectly, yin yang, right? If you don't understand the need for that balance, you slide off into madness. And until both sides go, hey, it's cool for me to really stand for my part of this if I show respect and have this really insane desire to have the other side. If we did that, then okay, like, people can say, look, I'm wired for, I can't have people stealing from me, right? The taxes is theft. And then the other side, like, we can't let these people like starve in the streets. If they both value each other and recognize, okay, this is an interplay between the two, I think we get somewhere. But we're so being forced into these factions. And because I'm a personal responsibility guy, even though I do not consider myself conservative at all, because I'm freakishly compassionate. But when I think Jordan Peterson said it the best when he was like, when you fractionate and fractionate and fractionate, you ultimately realize that you end up with the ultimate fraction, and that's the individual. We have this thing, you'll often refer to it as Goliath, but whatever. An entity, the elites, the whatever, government, whatever we want to label that thing as, is trying to blind us. But I don't think that they care about the efficacy of the vaccine. Like that feels like it's the symptom, not the thing they really care about. What they really care about, I think, is they want to make sure that you comply. And compliance is the game. And if you can see that they're fallible and talk about it, then it's much harder to get compliance. Does that feel right?
An element of it feels very right, but they left us with a mystery. They had a technology on which to build something that they called a vaccine, very deceptively, but they used that term to place it in our blind spot because most people, myself included, had the sense that vaccines were tremendously well tested, that the risks that come along with them tend to be small. COVID has forced a rethink of that. But if the entire point had been compliance, they would have been smart enough to recognize that the technology that they were using to make these shots was extremely risky and that it could well backfire because the range of pathologies that you could in principle trigger with such a shot was huge. So the question is, if the real point was, can we make you take a shot? The smart thing to do would have been to give a shot that was effectively neutral, that was a placebo. You know, maybe you could have such low concentrations of the active ingredient that it wouldn't have had any impact. And if they had done that, I think they'd be in a lot better position today because people would not in general have a list of friends who had some severe negative reaction to these things. And they would be able to play the same games they play with statistics to claim that they had been effective. And if they had done that and there wasn't a pattern of pathology, then all of those of us who were worried about what we were told these things were going to do to the body would look foolish. And their ability to get people to comply in the future would be that much greater. So I don't have the sense that a simple game of forcing people to comply could possibly explain the shots. For some reason, they wanted people to take them.
Okay, so I want to start teasing two ideas apart. So one, I want to figure out why they want to blind us. While I think it's overblown to say that America is declining like the Roman Empire, if you're thinking the Roman Empire declined quickly, when in reality, I think it's probably a very slow process that we may or may not be in. We may get better over the next 10 years and then collapse, who knows, or drag it out forever, whatever. So I think it is important for people to understand when they're talking about you or anybody else in that group that I see sort of being attacked now in a way that they weren't 5 or 6 years ago, to understand when you're saying, I think this is worthy of exploration, and when you're saying, I've explored a lot of stuff, and this one I'm really going to plant a stake in the ground. Because I have a feeling we're going to touch on both in the conversation today. Okay, so going back to the question I really want to pin down, which is why
are they
blind us? Yeah. What's the point?
Let's talk about the issue of blinding. And I'll just tell you my own thought process. I come from a background studying complex systems. I'm a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm very interested in levels of analysis. So I come to questions of how human societies function through that lens. And a hypothesis in such a case tends to be actually a nested series of sub-hypotheses. And you build them out, and the more that they stand up to new observations, the more truth they are likely to contain. So I build up a model, and if I see something next week that's inconsistent with it, my point is, well, my confidence in that model is pretty low. But if I have a model and it goes a year or 2 years, and all I see are things that actually fit with it, I tend to get the sense maybe it's right, or it's analogous to something that's right. So the question of why they are blinding us. Here is what I have become increasingly confident of. Again, it is a hypothesis, but it's amazing how well it predicts events and phenomena going forward. We are locked in competitive struggles all the time inherently, and that's not a bad thing. In fact, it's the engine that makes Western civilization work. It just needs to be placed in, I used to think of it as like the explosive energy in an internal combustion engine cylinder, right? An explosion isn't a productive thing, but in that context, it can be very, very productive. But when you are in a competitive system, there is an advantage that accrues to anybody who has superior information. And what this almost feels too obvious to me at this point for it not to be on everybody's mind, but we proceed by imagining that there is a level of patriotism that we share with other people in our system, that surely they have the same sense of America or the West being this marvelous structure in which to accomplish new things, to innovate, and they must therefore want to protect it as well. And we have a harder time grappling with, well, what if they don't see it in those terms? And what if actually there's a group of folks who's very powerful, who views democracy as a frightening mechanism that can upend whatever it is you're attempting to accomplish based on the whim of a public that may not know what it's doing. I mean, I understand that concern. Democracy can do things that are destructive. And so if you had a position of power, you might view the fact that the public can throw out leadership and install somebody who's saying things that resonate with them with a certain amount of trepidation. So if you didn't have the sense that the West and its obligation to the consent of the governed was a positive thing, you might start playing against people that we would tend to think they would be playing alongside. They would be building up a whole range of topics in which their superior information allowed them to get ahead at the expense of others. I mean, this is, if we think about a financial market, economists talk about the greater fool. How do you make money? You find somebody who understands less than you do, and you trade things, and basically you take advantage of what they don't understand, and their wealth is transferred to you in so doing. And that actually can be a positive force if what you understand is something about the future that is not clear to others. If you're really insightful, then you can get wealthy by seeing the future with greater clarity. But you can also do the same trick by blinding your competitors, by making it so that the information that they would use to figure out what's coming is not available to them. And what would that look like? Well, this is where the rubber meets the road with this idea. It would look like an attack on all of the things that allow us to navigate, all of the sources of public truth-seeking. It would look like an attack on all newspapers. It would look like an attack on universities and science. It would look like an attack on journals. It would ultimately look like an attack on the courts. And that just simply matches the evidence that we have. All of these public truth-seeking mechanisms are becoming dumber by the hour. And what that is doing is it is putting people who see this problem are correctly recognizing that they are much better off to unplug from those institutions and attempt to figure out what's going on outside of them. But what many of them do not realize is what a poor substitute for public truth-seeking that actually is. You know, I mean, it might be good for people like you and me. It brings an audience that wants to hear a conversation that hasn't been sanctioned by one of these lobotomized institutions. But from the point of view of the average person trying to figure out what to make of the advice that their doctor is giving them or the FDA is telling them about nutrition, it's a poor substitute. And it is the reason that I fear collapse, is that I don't, you can put on a blindfold and you can keep driving down the road for a time, but at some point there's going to be a curve. And we can't drive like this. We have to rescue ourselves from whatever it is, whatever force, whether I'm right about its nature or not, that is keeping us from establishing the basic facts of our lives.
Okay. Do you see this as a WEF super conspiracy, or is this just emergent behavior of people who get into positions of power, whether economically, like somebody running a big company, or politically, and they think, I like what I'm able to do better in this position. And so there's, whatever, 50,000 people that just have that slight inclination of, ooh, this would be a little better for me if I had a little bit more control. And then the emergent behavior starts to look like a coordinated attack, but in reality, it's just a lot of little people trying to make their own lives a little bit richer, more controlled.
I have substantial confidence that it is going to be a combination of both things. Now, I look at the WEF, and there's a part of me that thinks that's too dumb and too obvious to actually be the entity, that maybe it stands as a front for whatever actual thing is colluding behind the scenes. But I do think that there is a component that is quite obviously colluding against public understanding. But there are also numerous mechanisms that will cause people to innovate in the direction of that force without ever being contacted, without being paid by it. They will simply do it because a system of incentives causes them to move in the same direction. And we see this on topic after topic. If we try to establish the basic facts, for example, of climate change, what we find is fields full of people, presumably most of them are well-intentioned, concerned about what they see as a real emergency, and doing their best to elucidate it so the rest of us can see it. But if you've lived inside the academy, you know also that a field like climate science at the moment will not welcome countervailing evidence. And what that means is that the evidence you see doesn't have the implication that you think it has. Even if the studies you see are accurate, you're not seeing the studies that weren't done that would have provided a different view. And across all of these questions, our ability to have an open, frank conversation in which all of the evidence is aired is fundamental. It occurred to me the other day that this really is the reason that free speech and the free exchange of ideas is so tightly bound with the other rights of the West, is that the consent of the governed means nothing if the governed can't have a discussion that would allow them to vote in the direction of reason. So you can wreck a democracy by wrecking speech, even if people are perfectly free to vote for whatever they want. You don't need to game the election itself if the public mind is confused by being starved of actual information. So that's what I'm seeing, both in the informal sphere and very much in the institutional formal sphere. It's hallucinating, is what we're seeing. The hallucinations that will cause a person with suspicions to see them rendered in elaborate form. I don't know if I fully answered your question about emergence versus collusion.
Well, so you did, in the sense that you said it's going to be a combination of all of them. What I want to do is start pursuing what exactly that looks like in reality, because we may be saying exactly the same thing, or we may be saying something different. But my take goes something like this. You well know what I'm about to say because you're the one that taught it to me. But the Earth, its rotation, it changes, its tilt changes. There's like these three different things that add up, slight variations over different time scales that cause the Earth to cool and warm. And so we have, long before humans were here, ice age, no ice age, no ice age. And it went back and forth because of these slight perturbations that change, that determine how much cooler things get in the summer, how much snow then accumulates over years, which then turns into an ice age, and then it wobbles back the other way, and a little bit of snow melts, and a little more until you warm back up. Okay, so it's these huge macro trends that are basically colliding waves, and every now and then they hit it just the right way, and you get a rogue wave. And that's what I think is happening right now. There's probably a little bit of collusion. Yes, there's probably just the authoritarian desire for power. Yes, some people probably just aren't intellectually powerful enough to hold really nuanced ideas in their head. And so when you're dealing with social media and there's just a massive velocity and volume of information, I just need something. So I'm team blue, I'm team red, nice, simplistic. Just tell me what to do and I'm going to do it just so that I don't have to think through all these problems. And what this moment feels like is a rogue wave. I have no sense of how big the rogue wave is. I just know it's the biggest wave in my lifetime. So certainly possible that compared to the Civil War, this is nothing and we're super safe and all is going to be well. But what I want to begin teasing out are what are those elements that are coming together now. So we've talked about whether it's the WEF, but just like elites actually colluding. And I will say, the Fed, the way that banking is run, all of that, guaranteed, even if they're just out in the open, it is a group of people that have an agenda and they very much control what you know, what you understand, what they tell you when they tell you. They want to make sure that you understand as little about printing money as possible, so on and so forth. So you definitely have the what I'll call official collusion, maybe with the best of intentions, maybe not, but nonetheless. Then you get things happening at the local level where at the school board level, there's movements there that are taking over where they're trying to ice out parents and they've got the FBI investigating parents as terrorists. And so you've got some weird sort of local thing happening. Then you've got what's going on at the social media level where the platforms are being pressured on what to show, what not to show. On and on and on we go. But each of those feel to me that they are driven by the same sort of, it's all humans, but slightly different things. Like the Fed to me is not the same thing that's going on at the local school board.
Two things, and I don't want us to get lost, but your example, the Milankovitch cycles that cause the oscillation between ice ages and interglacials, is well chosen. And it illuminates actually the way to reconcile your presentation and mine. But I think your audience is going to have to indulge me in order to make it clear why. So we have these three orbital oscillations. We have the obliquity of the orbit. We have the precession of the axis of the Earth, and we have the degree of tilt. These things are independent of each other, and they oscillate on separate timescales. We have a 100,000-year cycle, a 41,000-year cycle, and a 21,000-year cycle. Each of them has a very tiny influence on the amount of solar radiation that actually reaches the Earth. Even together, they have a small impact. So if I was to push a button and cause them all to go into the phase where they cool the Earth for 1 year, you wouldn't be able to tell that year from any other. It might be slightly cool, but it would not be decidedly cool. What happens, though, is that when these patterns align such that they cause the amount of ice that remains in the northern hemisphere over the summer to be slightly larger, they turn the Earth slightly whiter because ice happens to be white, and white surfaces reflect energy back into space, which causes the following year to be slightly cooler. When the following year is slightly cooler, slightly more ice sticks around through the northern summer. The year after that is slightly cooler. So almost all of what causes glaciation to happen is the result of this amplifier. It is not the result of the Milankovitch cycles which set it in motion. It is the amplifier that does the work, right? It's like if you imagine Mick Jagger in the Rose Bowl singing his heart out. Nobody in the back row would be able to hear very much, right? It's the mechanisms that amplify his voice, but they're not adjusting the content of his voice. He's still Mick Jagger. He's just having a huge impact based on all of the things that amplify his voice and then project it to all of the people at home who weren't there. That is likely where we are. The actual collusion may be a tiny fraction of what's going on, but it's like a navigational fraction. It's setting our direction. And then these organic, emergent processes are causing it to become a terrifying force rather than, a joke where 10 apes gathered in a room and decided to steer the world in some direction. That sounds preposterous, but given the capacity for markets and fields of study to amplify thinking, to amplify motivated reasoning, we get the same kind of puzzle. So I don't disagree with you that the majority of it may be emergent, but I don't think that's the place to concentrate if we want to fight back. But the way to understand where we're headed is to focus on the part that is doing the steering. And that's not so easy to do because, of course, we're not invited. We have to extrapolate from the pattern on the outside.
Yes, but I think we'll be able to describe the phenomena of, okay, we're being blinded, we're being censored. There are things, the just massive attempt to shrink the Overton window so that so many things were not allowed to be spoken about, which again, from where I'm sitting, that feels like the emergent phenomena more than just overlords, because this really gets complicated. I've been over here trying to write down all the things that I think create this. So the current variations of the Milankovitch cycle. But so you've got growth has stopped, which we probably need to talk about. You've got just the internet and social media, again, going back to that idea of velocity and volume of information. You've got the nanny state, which I guess Jonathan Haidt wrote a new book about. Not read it yet, but I'm super eager to see the consequences of that. You've also got, I forget who wrote the book, but about therapists now just affirm, and how that's creating additional spiral of this sense of I need to be protected. And then you've also got just the postmodernist thinking that has swept through the institutions that now is, as we have a generation of people that have been taught that, they all have TikTok and Instagram accounts, and they're just blasting this stuff out there as fast as you can. And now, as from my thinking, beyond the collusion, those are the things that are creating this moment. Do you think I missed anything?
Well, you mentioned it in that last piece, but I'm not sure it's highlighted well enough yet. There is an aspect of social media that causes a totally unnatural amplification of very natural human tendencies. And I've been thinking more about the Overton window and the fact that it has an analytical connotation to it, right? What are the ideas that are beyond the ones we're ready to contemplate? But then I started to notice I've become increasingly suspicious of what I call polite society. And,
tell me more. What does that mean?
Well, polite society, at the risk of causing your audience to think me crazy, I accepted Alex Jones' offer to come on his program. And that caused an interesting freak out, most of which was not actually about what I said on Alex Jones' program, but it caused what I said on Joe Rogan's program to be scrutinized in a way that was new and I think quite mean-spirited. And
because people think Alex Jones is off his rocker. If you've gone on his show, you must be off your rocker. Let me go look at what you said and prove it.
Yes, but I also think there is a concern. I think going on Alex Jones' program would have made less sense before Tucker Carlson had interviewed him. That actually brought Alex Jones into discussion where it had formerly been possible just to simply dismiss him out of hand. And the problem with Alex Jones, from the point of view of polite society, is that he's not just simply wrong about everything. That would be easy to deal with, but he's often right. And so what does one do with somebody who has simply given up on staying within any bounds, is willing to explore any idea? That's very dangerous to certain folks. So my going there, I'm a PhD in biology. I've made a couple contributions to my field. And if I'm talking to Alex Jones, it creates a question. It causes a re-exploration of the question of whether or not one has to actually take him seriously. So that became the moment at which it was important to come up with reasons not to take me seriously, right? So that question could again be sidelined. And what I realized was that I was getting a lot of pushback from people who were driving up the cost for me doing what I did, right? That there was content in what they were saying, but the real message was, actually, you shouldn't have done that. It was a don't go there, girlfriend kind of a moment, right? And so I started to think about what that was made of. And I realized that polite society, which to me takes the form of, like a fractal set of cocktail parties, the people that you want to like you, that they have the ability to steer you by threatening not to invite you to the next one. And my feeling is I no longer care, because these folks have gotten so much so wrong that it's not obvious why their sanction should have value. And the more I thought about that question, the more I realized that polite society exists in every era. And I leave open the possibility that it might have a positive amplifying effect in a good era, right? That it might spur people to accomplish great things so that they could, be heralded at the next cocktail party for their insights. But I realized, if you've seen, there's some photographs that were discovered somewhere in the last couple decades, a Nazi photo album that had been languishing in somebody's attic. And it revealed not the stuff that we're so familiar with from the Holocaust, but it revealed the private recreational lives of Nazis outside of Auschwitz.
I heard something about this, but no.
It's remarkable. And there are a couple of photographs that I find just absolutely chilling, where there are these, well-dressed Nazi girls. One of them, they're enjoying blueberries, right? Bowls of blueberries, like right outside of Auschwitz.
Woof.
Yeah, it's wild. And I guess my feeling is, look, actually, no, I want to turn the spotlight back on polite society. And I want to ask the question, which is, why should we care what you think at this moment when okay, polite society is very committed to the idea that we have no choice but to vote for Joe Biden because of the terrifying prospect of Donald Trump being elected again. Well, if polite society was making any sense, it wouldn't be running Joe Biden as a hedge against the reelection of Donald Trump. It would offer up somebody serious. It would, in fact, sideline its influence peddling racket so that was not an important argument against voting blue in this election. If it cared about us, that's what it would do. And the fact that it doesn't do that suggests that actually it's as cynical as it ever was, but it wants the little people to jump based on a fear of Donald Trump that is irrational, in my opinion. Right? So when that's the game afoot, when polite society wants to turn, its gaze on me and say, you're out of line, but it's not looking at the DNC and saying, what the hell are you people doing? Do you realize what you're playing with? Joe Biden shouldn't have been elected in the last election. The idea of running him again at this even more advanced state of decrepitude is insane, and yet doesn't cause the Democratic machine to blink. So anyway, my point again, and I think this is important to say clearly, I'm not accusing anybody of Nazi-like defects. That's not my point about the Nazi girls and their blueberries. My point is, polite society existed right outside of Auschwitz. It exists in every era. The fact that it does or doesn't invite you to its cocktail party has to be evaluated. The meaning of that has to be evaluated in the context of whether or not polite society is doing its job of amplifying the good things about civilization, or if it's doing the exact opposite and actually making us worse, making us petty and superstitious. And that is exactly what I think it's doing at the moment. So I guess I'm gladder to be outside of it and not welcome at those parties than I would be continuing to attend them.
Okay, so again, this is something that I concretized after listening to you, but the idea that shame has its place. You've said you don't want to throw that out. You have to understand it. You've used pain oftentimes as the example. If you go to a doctor and they think that pain is in and of itself a malady that is to be gotten rid of, you've got a problem, because pain is signifying there's an issue that you need to address, and it is adaptive, not maladaptive. I would say the same thing about polite society, though I will agree with you that you don't want to blindly accept polite society. So I'm going to take that as the shame mechanism. And I'm going to say, okay, I'm not going to discard this lightly. But the thing that I disagree with and what you just said is that I don't think polite society will ever be its own policeman. And so this is why we need you call yourself, I think, a reluctant radical. So it's like we need reluctant or otherwise, we need the people that sit outside of polite society to also work their thing. And so while there's always going to be friction between polite society and the radicals, my whole mission in life is to get people to understand that you need to exist in dynamic tension. Like you don't want those two things to conform to each other. I would not want polite society to give up their sense of like, this is how things should be. And I would not want the radicals to conform to polite society. So you need both of those things. They serve well only when they're in juxtaposition. Now, getting specific about Alex Jones. Okay, so one thing that as I watch you, you are very much a part of my sense-making apparatus. People can take that how they want, but Sam Harris is a part of my continued sense-making apparatus, and I know people have beef with him. And my thing is like, I'm not going to believe everything you say or he says or anybody says. I think everybody's job is to take the best information they can get, discard the stuff that they think, for whatever reason, isn't bang on, and then synthesize their own thing. And if you can't think for yourself, you already have a problem. So when I think about, okay, for you, is there, knowing that you use this hypothesis, thesis dichotomy, is there a limit to what you think is a hypothesis that you will put out there? Do you have a governing matrix paradigm in your own thinking that says, this hypothesis I will present publicly, this one I won't, which will then tie into whether going on Alex Jones may have been, I haven't seen it, so I have no idea if you were like the voice of reason in the room. I think of him as somebody who has absolutely no Overton window. He will talk about literally anything. And so I would not want to see him censored, because, hey, better let me sort the wheat from the chaff rather than that be a top-down decision. However, I put him in a very specific box because he has seemingly no self-governance around what he will talk about. So do you have a thing that governs what hypothesis you will and won't publicly explore?
That's a great question. And it's odd. I don't exactly know the answer to it. Let me tell you how I think about it, though. There are certain properties that have a paradoxical nature. Free speech is one of them. We could waste the rest of both of our lives parsing the various examples of where speech has had some implication and whether or not the effect was negative or positive at a net level. But at the end of the day, the right answer is speech needs to be essentially perfectly free, and the net outcome of that is positive. Likewise, I would say I've been engaged reluctantly in a battle with a person on Twitter who has been a very strong and I think not forthright advocate for the standard narrative on things like COVID vaccines. He wishes continued engagement. I don't want to further engage him because I don't believe that he is actually working forward from evidence to a conclusion. I believe he's working backwards from a conclusion, and so I don't think it's an honest debate. But my point would be this. In an honest debate, let's say that we have an honest debate over something that matters a great deal, like whether or not these shots are safe enough to give to a human being. Do I say, well, either the shots are going to kill more people or not taking them is going to kill more people? And if I have an argument with somebody about it and I'm saying, hey, I think the shots are going to kill more people, and it turns out that the shots save more people than were killed, am I then responsible for those deaths? Absolutely not. The way this works is anybody on either side of an honest exploration is contributing to us knowing more about where the dangers are and where the values are. Both sides get credit as long as they're doing it in good faith. As soon as somebody steps out of the realm of good faith, they no longer are in that position. They actually own the downsides of their argument. If you're going to argue that I'm responsible for the deaths if I misunderstand something, then the point is, well, if it turns out you're wrong, you're responsible for those deaths because you chose that argument. But if you're willing to participate with me in exploring this and we can take up contrary positions and at the end of the day, we both get credit for making the question clearer, that's a world I'm happy with. So again, is there a limit to what I will present? Well, if there is a limit, it is a threshold very different from most people. And it has been, I can trace it back at least to college. In college, taking an evolutionary biology course, my final paper, the course was taught by Bob Trivers, very famous and influential evolutionary biologist. My final paper for the course was an exploration of the question of whether or not Hitler was in fact an insane maniac, or whether what he did could be understood in, it's obviously as immoral as you get, but could it be understood in rational terms from an evolutionary perspective? Now that is something I've been told is a question we must not explore. And worse, I've been told that it can't possibly be true, right? People don't want it explored, and they wish to lodge an answer to the question without exploring it, which I can't respect. But the fact that, since I was in college and would have been 1991, I guess, I've been exploring questions like that tells you that I'm willing to go places others won't. Now, I do so knowing that I do so carefully, that I bring tools to the table and that I have an obligation not to say things I believe are untrue. And I am trusting in some sense that the reality that I will end up unearthing is a valuable thing to have awareness of. If it is worth exploring the possibility that genocide is a rational objective, immoral, but a rational objective, my belief is the likelihood that we will actually be able to prevent future genocides is increased if we understand that connection. Could I be wrong about that? I could be. But I'm a scientist to the core. I believe that unearthing the truth is valuable in the end. Even if I die believing something that turns out to be reversed later on, the process gets us there over time, and it does embolden our best values.
All right, this is really interesting. I firmly believe that
everybody has a worldview. It's what I call whole life beer goggles. So everyone sees the world through a distorted lens, and we all get to distort that lens in whatever way we choose. Most people don't realize that. So they're born with something, they live in a value system, they just adhere to whatever they grew up with. But the warping of that lens is a combination of what you believe, your values, and your genetics. What I'm hearing is a mapped value system from you that makes a prediction. So you're willing to explore whether Hitler or anybody else that commits a genocide is acting rationally. Immorally, you were very clear about that, but rationally. Some people, as you said, are going to say that's beyond the pale, because if you find out that the answer is yes, the world gets a little worse. Because now I can't just lop him off at the knees and say completely beyond the pale, it's all bad, it's only evil. The second you see it evil, react, go crazy. So the value that I think what you just said predicts is that truth and understanding trump even grotesque, detrimental results.
Well, it depends if I understand what you just said. I am not saying that the value of knowing the truth is inherently greater than whatever harm might come of it.
But how will you know until you explore it?
I won't. I could try to parse every instance of speech and figure out which, and I do. Obviously, the right to say anything is not the same thing as believing that you should say everything. But the exploration of studyable patterns, I believe, in the end, inherently produces more value.
I'm beginning to understand how you get yourself in so much trouble.
Are you?
Mr. Weinstein, yes. Okay, so it's interesting though, and I think I'll be able to represent what you're doing in a way you will recognize, but if I go wrong, let me know. Okay. So this all started because I'm trying to map the way that you think. And what you said about Hitler exploring genocide as a potentially rational, immoral, but rational act was to, I think, explain the underlying value system that you make these decisions on, because we were trying to figure out what hypotheses would you or would you not explore. Okay, so I said that truth and understanding trump grotesque and detrimental results. You said, no, that's not quite right, because you said that exploring that thing does not outweigh the potential damaging effects of knowing said thing. So if that's true, then in the Hitler as potentially rational example, you don't think that the knowledge of that will create a negative outcome that is worth shutting down the exploration for.
Okay, I think I now am seeing this more clearly. Do you have further you wanted to go?
If I've already gone off track, no, you should bring.
No, you haven't gone off track. I have just completed Bobby Kennedy's new book on, it's called The Wuhan Cover-Up. It is just like his last book, The Real Anthony Fauci. It is mind-blowing. It's really shocking. It's an encyclopedic exploration of a quest for bioweapons that I had almost no understanding of before reading this book. The bioweapons question allows us to see the answer you're looking for, because I would not argue that the simple fact that there are viruses in nature that could be enhanced in ways that might tell us something about possible human impacts on health from future pandemics, or that might be enhanced in ways that would tell us something about weapons. We cannot continue down this road, right? The degree to which our exploration of those questions in the lab will result in massive human harm.
What if you never made the virus, but you just explored gain of function theoretically?
Well, that's the question. Is my sense is, A, there is no mechanism by which you can prevent people from thinking about these questions, nor should you, because if you open the door to telling people what they can and cannot contemplate analytically,
door's open, baby.
Okay, but my point is, no, analytically, we have to be able to talk about these things, just as I have to be able to talk about the actual evolutionary meaning of rape and genocide, right? Doesn't make those conversations fun. It doesn't mean Could somebody hear a discussion of that and be inspired to go spread his genes? I suppose. But the value of understanding that pattern, the value, frankly, for women understanding the pattern, the degree to which it empowers them to make themselves safer from this hazard is significant enough that one can't parse. If you focus too much on the possible harms, you will miss the fact that there is effectively a related rates problem that makes the benefit of understanding these things exceed the cost. But I would not take that to the level of experiment, right? The level of experiment has all kinds of perils that we should not engage. But the level of abstraction, I believe we are simply better off becoming as informed as we possibly can on every topic that has implication for human well-being.
Have you looked at the IQ literature?
A little.
What do you think about that? That's another hyper-fraught, purely ideological. It's just a thought, just an idea.
Yeah.
Man, does it freak people out.
But I wish I had a better example for this. But when I was a kid, there was a children's book that we read in my family. It was called The Monster at the End of This Book. Do you know the monster at the end of this book?
I don't, but I can make a lot of guesses based on the title.
The monster at the end of this book is a book in which Grover becomes afraid because the cover of the book tells you that there is a monster at the end of the book, and he attempts to prevent the turning of the pages because every page you turn brings you closer to what at the end of the book is going to be a monster. And of course, you turn all the pages of the book, and the monster at the end of the book is Grover. Nothing to be worried about, right? Now, my point is we can look at all of these topics and we can spook ourselves about the danger that one of these topics is going to put us in some terrible circumstance we can't get out of, and that we should try to imagine in advance without knowing what is at the end of the book. We should try to imagine in advance which of these topics should be taboo because you don't want to go there. But in so doing, you are more or less saying, oh, I know what's probably there, and we can't afford to know that in any factual way. So that can't possibly be right, because how do you know if you haven't gone down that road? So here's the thing. I'm not afraid of this IQ discussion. I think I know about where it lands. It could have been far worse than I believe the evidence actually suggests. And I'll tell you where I think it goes. And there is a bitter pill, but what is the net impact of understanding the implications of the IQ literature? I believe it is actually liberating for all of us humans. It is not going to be the thing that people fear.
Why are you worried about shutdown STEM?
I agree with you. It is absolutely the most terrifying piece of this. It's also the most absurd piece. But I think the reason that it is so terrifying is that it speaks to a willingness to uninvent insight in order to make progress, right? And that tells you what kind of progress they want to make. So to the extent that one is willing to take a tool as universal as the scientific method and to critique it, to declare it some sort of a European thing, right? To declare it white in order to nullify its power to speak is, I guess I know exactly what it is. It's Plato's cave. And, you started talking about the Matrix, and Plato's cave is the Matrix. And the thing about the Matrix and Plato's cave is the desire of most people, many people, some important force not to be enlightened, right? That there's something that is served by, the killing of the person who's seen what's outside the cave when they come back and try to report. That's the most frightening process of all. And those of us who have tried to convey something about the danger that we are in know that there is this force of resistance that is very powerful, that wants to kill the messenger in order to keep doing what it's doing. And to hear it spelled out, that we are fighting about so many things which are just simply unambiguous, that 5 years ago, you would think there's no way we're ever going to have an analytical argument about whether or not men and women are effectively the same thing, right? Because everybody knows that they're not the same thing, right? And then to find yourself there and to find yourself trying to fend off arguments that make no sense tells you that that the momentum behind this is not driven by any sort of analysis. It is driven by just a naked desire for power. And I think the thing is, we know how that ends. We don't necessarily know who the winners and losers are, but it ends with something of which we will all be terribly ashamed. And
spell out why that's true. I agree aggressively, but I want you to say why that's true.
So I've been thinking a lot about this of late, and it occurred to me at one point that the United States is special, and it's special because it attempts to do something that I know is possible, but is very, very difficult, which is to step out of the normal evolutionary dynamic and do something better. So the normal evolutionary dynamic has us cooperating on the basis of our relatedness. The same reason that, you will aid your kids before you'll aid somebody else's kids works at a population level, which means that a kind of racism is wired into us as the default mode of cooperation and conflict. The United States aims to set aside those population level differences to foster a cooperation based on something else. It's, in some weird sense, it is the Christian insight of the story of the Good Samaritan, that relatedness is not the basis on which we should view each other favorably, that there is something to be gained by being inclusive, empathically inclusive, and collaborating because it makes us stronger. The problem is, as great an idea as that obviously is, it's been incredibly contagious. The number of countries that have followed our example and, modeled themselves on our pattern is stunning. For us to, instead of completing the project, instead of actually bringing ourselves to a place where opportunity is evenly distributed, to go in reverse and to reinvigorate the population against population conflict, means that effectively all there will be in the end is power, and the limits of compassion will be genetically defined. And that is the recipe in which you find people genociding each other or cooking up reasons to go to war across a border, whatever it is. It's uninteresting, to be sure. It is shameful to return there after having discovered that something else is possible. And I can't imagine why anybody is going to be surprised that the outgrowth of putting race first is going to be, maybe Leonard Cohen got it. I've seen The Future Brother. It's murder.
I really hope not. You said something not too long ago that was both hilarious and it made me work. It's exactly what people aren't doing. You said, I want to emphasize one word, people: extrapolate. And I was like, yes, please. Like, follow that logic to its natural conclusion. And that sums up why I am freaked out by them coming after STEM, because it was the one thing that I held on to was, okay, if you just get people to follow their own logic, you realize how problematic it gets. And they would have to do away with logic altogether. And they're never going to, wait, what? And it's like, they're actually getting rid of logic. It's the moment in the argument where you're like, I'm not even going to say anything. I'm just going to ask questions, because I know if once I ask a certain number of questions, they will get to the point where they realize, oh shit, okay, cool. I see where this goes. Because it never occurs to you that they would actually throw out measuring progress, having a goal, seeing if you're actually getting towards that goal. And so when they start going, the second most disturbing thing to come out of all of this was the Smithsonian, these are all the things that are white and are therefore problematic. And it was like hard work, progress, measuring results, striving to be the best. I was like, what the fuck is happening? You literally, I have So I have to get into a little bit of my story, a smidgen of it. So when you're working in manufacturing, which is where I was working, you're in the inner cities. So you're around only people of color. I mean, almost exclusively. And so I'm encountering all these people and I'm like, okay, Tom, are your ideas real? Because you always say it doesn't matter who you are today. It only matters who you want to become and the price you're willing to pay to get there. Well, if that's true, Tom, then you'd be willing to hire convicted felons, would you not? And I was like, yeah, actually, I would. And so we put out on the street, as they call it, that we would hire people, we would consider people for employment, even if they had a felony record. And so we ended up getting all of these like way low income people that had really struggled, had trouble with the law, former drug dealers, gangbangers, like guys with the teardrop tattoos and all that. And I was, not everybody, but I was very impressed with the number of people who were extraordinary people, incredibly capable, able to do stuff. They just had a weird ass frame of reference. And if I could give them an empowering frame of reference, then, they could go on to do something. And walking them down the line of like, hey, here's how you improve something. You have a goal, you set it, you have a metric that you're marching towards. That just seemed, if you can get them on that path, then you've really got something that's going to take you somewhere impactful. But once you strip away that ability and you say, hey, that's white, and so you don't want to act white or be white, I'm like, the one thing you've given me that's allowing me to help these people, like we had one guy, he took the job because he wanted to front for his drug money. Okay. Imagine that. He comes in, he interviews because he hears this crazy guy is willing to hire people with felony convictions. He had been to prison, not for drugs, oddly enough, but he had been to prison for something else and then was dealing again but had to show his parole officer where he was getting the money. So, and he tells me all this to my face later once we had gained trust with each other. And he was like, dude, you've changed my life. You've changed the lives of my kids. Like this is going to echo for generations. There was one guy that called me. I hadn't spoken to him probably in 6 years. He called me, this is a few weeks ago. He's like, Tom, I'm on my way to a job. I'm getting paid almost $100,000. I would never have believed this was possible. And I just had to thank you. And I was like, this is why instead of buying an island and retiring, like I've doubled down in my life because I see the number of people that, change my frame of reference. I didn't get smarter. I just look at things differently. I'm using metrics. Like I have a goal because that was my whole thing to them. You have a goal. And my thing I always preach is do and believe about yourself, that which moves you towards your goals, right? So because a lot of people get stuck in these loops of I'm stupid, I'm dumb, the world's against me, whatever. And so I'm like, does that belief help you achieve your goal? No. Cool. Then don't buy into it. Even if the world really is against you, even if the deck really is stacked against you, accepting defeat does not move you towards your goal. So don't do it. And so when I read that and I was like, what are you doing? Like you are stripping people of the most powerful possible tools by saying the tools themselves are somehow corrupt because of who quote unquote created it. I'm like, this is fucking madness. It either works or it doesn't.
Yeah, it's crazy. Heather and I have long wondered about this Audre Lorde quote about you can't take apart the master's house with the master's tools. And it's just the most disempowering viewpoint. I'm not even entirely sure what she meant, but the way this is understood, it just takes the most powerful things at human disposal and keeps them in the hands of those who have had them longest. I mean, it inverts the process of ending oppression, and it's hard to imagine why anybody who sees their objective as ending oppression would embrace this. You should want to capture those tools, and you should want to learn to wield them as effectively as you possibly can, right? The tools don't know who's wielding them. They work because they work. And if you're going to rule out things that work because of who discovered them first, and I'm not even sure it is who discovered them first, but who, our collective narrative says discovered them first, then you're never going to get anywhere. So yes, it is incredibly frightening to hear people go up against logic and science. And the funny thing is, Evergreen did allow us to have these conversations up close and personal. And so I think a lot of people dismiss the idea that people are against STEM, people in this movement are against it because they haven't heard somebody say it while looking into their eyes. Oh, yes, science really is a white thing. It's like, what are you even... Did you just say that? I mean, that's almost all I need to know about your proposal for the world, is that you just don't understand even the basics of, where liberation would come from, right? So, yeah, I wish I could convey that better. I'm glad somebody heard me say extrapolate and knew what I meant, because I really,
very
I
much
do think
so.
it's the missing parameter. If you just take what you know to be factual and extrapolate from it, you can see where we're headed, and it couldn't be more frightening.
It really couldn't be more frightening. And staying on the notion of one thing that bothers me is people are always looking for a reason not to listen to somebody. And so I have beliefs, and I wrote these beliefs a very long time ago, so they have nothing to do with the current moment. Like you said, that they are the things that have worked in my life, and I wrote them down so that I could give them to other people, because I really am obsessed with equal opportunity. And that's been a passion of mine now for more than a decade. And look, I've made moves in my life that I will say put me beyond reproach in terms of, like I said, hiring, former felons or felons, but no longer in prison, and just putting my money where my mouth is and, seeing what happens. And it really, I find a disturbing trend that people jump to any reason they have not to learn from somebody. So, I mean, it obviously extrapolate, it becomes cancel culture. And I was giving an example yesterday, and I thought this is actually really, it is the trap that I would be curious to see how somebody who has this ideology, would handle it. So let's say that you have a daughter. It's somehow worse if it's a little girl, for me anyway. You have a daughter and she is, in anaphylactic shock. Her throat has closed. And you call 911, and the most vile and despicable person in the world answers that call, but they know how to perform an infield tracheotomy, and so they can save your daughter. Do you hang up the phone and try to find somebody else who you agree with and you'd be willing to take their advice, which in my opinion makes you an even more despicable person because you're now making your child suffer and the risk of death, is now skyrocketing? Or do you say, I don't give a shit that you are the most despicable person on earth. You have a piece of information that actually gets me something that I need and that I want. And my thing is, dude, it is a litmus test from which I will say, I can't understand your worldview. Like, your value system is so divorced from mine. And I'll say mine is probably, like, if you boiled my value system down to just its basic, irreducible building block, it's do things that alleviate human suffering. It's going to be something like that. That's sort of the thing below that. Like, if somebody disagrees with that, then I'm at a loss now. I no longer how to communicate. I don't know how to communicate. So that argument to me is the sort of ultimate extrapolation of, I'm trying to shut that person down because they're a bad person. I don't want to hear their ideas. My thing is, look, if there were two people in front of me and one was a despicable person and the other was somebody who inspired me and I thought they were amazing and they both have the same information, of course, I'm going to gravitate towards the person. Even in subtle ways of rewarding them with my thanks and praise and, I have chosen them. And of course that will feel good for them. I get why I would want to lavish people who I really believe in with that. So cool. All things being equal, I get it. We're all going to self-select to, celebrating things and people that we like, but shutting down learning something. And now this brings you to, like, if Unity 2020 is the concept that you're just one of the things you really want to get out there, one of the things I am most desperate to get people to understand, like to really understand at a visceral level, it's that skills have utility. They let you do things. And you don't read a book to check a mark off. You don't go to college to impress your parents. You take architecture classes so you can build a bridge that doesn't fall down. And once you understand that, and that if you can do something other people can't do, like you've now just moved humanity forward or your small group forward, like that shit is real. And when I say that, I don't see like this recognition in people's eyes of like, hey, the point of learning something is to actually be able to do something. And so my new thing is to get people to understand your mind is not a library. Your mind is a laboratory. And once you realize, the point of this knowledge is to run tests against it to see what actually allows me to influence the world. And my obsession is power. Let that echo and let lightning strike and sinister noise play. Because whenever I tell people that I come seeking power, people get freaked the fuck out until I say, let me define power for you. Power is the ability to close your eyes, imagine a world better than this one, and then open your eyes and be able to make that world come true, because it's going to require you to do things. And if you don't have the skill set to do those things, you are disempowered. So yeah, getting people to understand that feels like an uphill battle sometimes.
No, that's beautiful, and I resonate with it 100%. And in some sense, I think what's happened is we've so badly botched the job of educating people that they register in some sense that it's too late. And so the mind-numbing prescriptions that were being delivered, I think, are surrender. That basically people who understand that they have been effectively cognitively maimed are not really interested in the idea that the right way to solve the problem is to increase the capacity of your mind to find new possibilities and bring them into the world. So instead, it's the temper tantrum that you started with, which, I get it. We can't do that, but I get it. I understand that they're angry and they have a right to be.
All right. I want to shift gears because I would be horrified if I had an evolutionary biologist 2 hours with them and I did not ask a question that has been on my mind since I was like 15. Bret, as weird as this question is, it actually means something to me, and I ask it in all sincerity. Why is the clitoris on the outside?
Well, okay, this is a good question. Let's put it this way. I don't think the focus should be on the anatomical structure, right? There's bound to be an answer to that. Let's put it this way. The fact that testicles are on the outside is also an interesting oddity. But let's say the interesting thing is that selection has altered the meaning of sex for humans, right? It has delivered us an incredible gift, which we are now treating so horrifyingly. But the gift is it has turned sex into a bonding mechanism. And what that means is that unlike almost all creatures, human beings have sex when the production of offspring is not a possibility. That is to say, people have sex after menopause. They have sex when it's not the fertile moment in a woman's cycle. And that, I think people don't understand how unique a situation that is. And what it implies is that human bonding is a novel phenomenon that requires both parties to feel rewarded by the activity. So in some sense, the orgasm has been democratized by selection, and a mechanism for generating it has been provided by adaptation. And interestingly, the mechanism for generating it is not a simple button, right? Right? It's just not a simple button. It actually requires an empathic connection in order to tune into your partner well enough to deliver the goods. And in some sense, that's the magic of the thing, is by creating a puzzle surrounding sexual gratification in women, the necessity of a close connection is introduced into pair bonding. Is that making sense?
It is. I have a loaded question waiting if that is the natural breakpoint. So my question is, am I wrong in assuming that for literally thousands of years, and maybe far longer than that, it was neglected, and that generation after generation after generation of women failed to have a a life where orgasm was a regular part of it due to that, which if that's the case, it does not seem that evolution would land on that as a strategy. It may be a byproduct, maybe a total accident, but it seems that it probably isn't a strategy unless, and this was, I can't remember where I read this, and it was so interesting to me that I thought, could this really be true? That it was put on the outside so that women, it wasn't, like if you think of the penis as a very, it's external, it's easily touched by anybody who wants to bond. And certainly in other animals, you'll see it isn't just the person that they're having intercourse with that will reach out and touch them in a way that we would call sexual, as a way to ease tension or whatever. And so I thought, is this a way of putting something on the outside so that women also have just a social bonding, a way to soothe or, extend sort of an olive branch of kinds, between two people, could be male, female, could be female, female, and that it needed to be on the outside to be more easily accessible?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know of any evidence to support it. I will say I'm doubtful that the orgasm in females was. It may be true that in European culture, for example, it was turned taboo, and therefore a kind of generating orgasm for females is kind of a lost art. But I think in many other cultures, it's quite clear that there was an awareness of the subtleties of sexual pleasure for females. So in any case, if Europeans really did lose touch with female orgasm, I believe that's an anomaly. It probably has a meaning to it. In other words, there are it is true that the structures that exist are adaptations, and it is true that religious prohibitions against their access are also evolutionary adaptations. And so there's a question about what is being managed by these tensions. But I love the idea that placing it on the outside means that it is not, strictly speaking, an intercourse triggered phenomenon. That, of course, raises questions about the G-spot and its location. But anyway, it's an interesting line of questioning. I understand why you're obsessed with it. It's fascinating, and clearly selection had something in mind. I will say the fly in the ointment of this discussion might be one of anatomical constraint. In other words, because the clitoris is made of the same tissue that the penis is made of, it may be that its position is actually constrained by the amount of shared blueprint that male and female have in terms of where tissues end up. So I don't know.
That is super interesting. There is certainly some logic to that, but so in terms of the design of the clitoris, if I'm not mistaken, there are elements of the nerve that wraps around the vaginal canal, which that always made more sense, because then at least it seems like it's sort of in on the act, and shows that you could put theoretically those tendrils anywhere, and that one would assume that nature ran some sort of experiment where there was more involvement, because there are some women, at least as I understand it, there are some percentage of women that can have orgasm from traditional penetrative sex. So it becomes a question of why, if we think of that as sort of an experiment that nature ran, why did it not go all the way? Why did it hit some percentage of women, but not all? Especially if, and I am sort of making the base assumption that women are more likely to get pregnant if they also have an orgasm.
There is actually data on this. I'm trying to remember what the conclusion is. You can't hold me to this. It's possible I have it wrong. But I think, if I'm remembering it correctly, the result was that orgasm did increase the likelihood of fertilization if one controls for fertile period, right? For the place in a woman's cycle that sex is taking place. I hope that's correct.
That's certainly what I encountered. I am by no means an expert on the subject, but that was the one that made me go, wow, this is so interesting. Then why are the two divorced? Like, it just seems so strange to me.
Well, but in some sense, I think that's reflective of the answer I gave you initially, which is there's a tremendous amount about courting and other associated rituals, which now become things like marriage and engagement in humans, that is built to ensure that males don't game females. In other words, females have a tremendous investment in offspring automatically, just by virtue of carrying them internally and then feeding them by breast. Males can have a very high investment in offspring, and that's a very frequent way for males to reproduce, but they obviously can have an almost no investment version of the strategy, which, although it's less successful because raising offspring without a father is more difficult, it is such a bargain from the point of view of males that males find the prospect of it irresistible, right? This is why males are obsessed with sex with women that they don't have any intention of seeing again. So, in light of that, females are built, they are both wired and programmed to avoid men who are resistant to commitment. And so the point is, in some sense, the conception of a child with a man who is diligent about delivering sexual pleasure is liable to be that's a more secure bond than sex with a man who's only interested in his own pleasure. So you could imagine the system wouldn't that make sense?
That is super fucking interesting. Now that's 4D chess right there. Like, all right, let's see how far you're willing to go to make sure that I'm taken care of as well. Jesus, that is fucking interesting, man. That is really interesting. Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
No, please. I want to learn more here.
Well, I was just going to say, that this all raises this issue of how frivolously we are treating sex and how stupid it is, because in some sense, we could have been given no greater gift than a weirdly yin-yang symmetrical sexual landscape that you spend a lifetime exploring with somebody. I mean, that's just... It'd be hard to make up something that wonderful, and we're treating it just so stupidly.
Dude, this is where, going back to the data becomes so interesting because, one, like the moment that I just had where you gave me something that I had a whole sort of belief around, like why the clitoris is on the outside, and I could tell it at cocktail parties and always gets a big reaction. And you came along, you gave me something that like totally knocks that off and is like, even more interesting. And it's like, man, I love those moments, right? But it's an empirical question. Ultimately you can look at the data and find out which one's real and like, whoa, that's real. And then really beginning to understand it, like begins to, peel back the onion, as it were. And so even looking at sex and monogamy and the different types of pair bonding that we have and how they can change from one environment to the next and why that, like, once you're able to look at the data and say, like, I never would have guessed. I've heard people say there's like 3 things you have to do to succeed in America. I may get these wrong, and if you know them, please tell me that I'm wrong. But I think they are: don't have a child out of wedlock, get a high school diploma, and get a job. It's something like that, like these really basic 3 things, all but guarantee you entrance into the middle class. And it's one of those, look at the data. And Thomas Sowell is somebody that blew my mind when all of this kicked off. And it was like, I had some weird unease that Black Lives Matter wasn't about actually helping Black people, but I didn't know enough about it. So I was like, I didn't want to post Black Lives Matter, but I was like, I need to go research this and figure out what's going on. And so I went on like this binge where I was like, I'm only going to seek out Black intellectuals and see where they fall. And it introduced me to some of the greatest minds. Thomas Sowell, to me, in a subconscious way, when I look at him, I see he might as well be wearing a Superman outfit. Like when you hear that guy talk, he's so smart in a way that I'm so covetous of, and he's so well researched. It is crazy. And whenever somebody debates him, he's always like, show me the data. Like, I will follow the data wherever it goes. I don't have some agenda that I'm trying to push. I'm just telling you, you want this thing to win because it feels so good. And he was like, but if you look at the data and it doesn't win, then don't you want to find the thing that wins? And that to me is just so powerful of like data, man. Like there is an answer. And if you have the discipline of not tying your identity up into an answer and you stay open to, new truth, it's like, and you might know, I misquote this person all the time. I think it was Max Planck who said science advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah, funeral by funeral.
And I just thought, oh my God, why? How do you not read that quote and go, oh, I have to change everything about myself because I refuse to fall for something so predictable?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the point you were headed toward a minute ago, where the Black Lives Matter movement is explicitly anti-nuclear family, that this is again one of these issues of, look, if you're going to attack science and you're going to declare it white and you're going to say the nuclear family is white and that therefore we have to uninvent these things, you cannot have power. If you have power over us, you'll destroy us because you're taking things that are actually part of our birthright and you're declaring them null and void. Either you know that's insane and you have an ulterior motive, or you don't know it's insane and you need to figure out how to think more clearly because this is just nuts.
Absolutely nuts. Yeah. When people don't look at the data, I get super, super, super uneasy. That one really feels like a recipe for disaster. So really fast, I'm super curious. How do you think this plays out? Like your predictions on where we were going back when this was just evergreen were spot on. Your testimony in front of Congress, spot on. What comes next? Where are we headed in very specific terms?
Well, I think it's very hard to be specific because you have a kind of fork that we can't tell which branch we're going to end up on. It's possible that events cause the election to go towards Trump, which I think is far more likely than people imagine based on current polling. One, we should have learned our lesson in 2016 about polls and Trump, that they don't tell the full story. And two, this is 2020, and events, even if you take the power of the presidency out of the question, events could turn things around inside of a week. So that could happen. But in light of the powers of the presidency, I don't see Trump allowing himself to go to a stunning defeat without dramatic moves on his part to reverse that. And I fear what he might do to avoid it. On the other hand, let's say nothing happens in 2020 and the president resists the urge to do something dramatic. Biden somehow wins, then we have an even more frightening prospect potentially, which is not more of the same, but something brand new, which is the Democratic Party having partnered with the Black Lives Matter movement, where it actually takes some of the insanity that they've been saying and turns it into policy, which I think is quite plausible because the purpose of the Democratic Party has become the protection of those rent-seeking elites that it represents, and this is the moment at which rent-seeking elites are facing something like the French Revolution, and so directing the people at each other so that they ignore the folks who have hoarded the opportunity is a natural move. This is a new twist on it, but it's a familiar pattern of history. So anyway, I guess what I would say is there's a reason that that I really think we have to be looking at something like Unity 2020, which is both prospects are absolutely dire. And the fact that we have a system that not only delivers you unacceptable possibilities, but delivers them in pairs in which there's no escape, that's completely unacceptable. And I think we have to take up arms against it, metaphorically speaking.
As somebody who doesn't want to hoard opportunity, but has literally no idea, like I don't feel like I'm hoarding opportunity. I feel like I am desperately trying to get more people to. But when I hear you say that, I always feel like he knows something I don't. He's talking about something that I don't quite understand. How are people hoarding opportunity, and how can somebody like myself not hoard opportunity?
Well, first of all, you don't sound to me like you're hoarding opportunity. To the extent that you might be, it's buried in your portfolio somewhere. But I don't think you're actively doing it.
But what
Quite
does
the opposite.
active hoarding look like?
Well, let's put it this way. There is a reason that our public schools suck, right? It never gets stated, which is that a large number of people do not want other people's children equipped to compete with their own children, right?
Are people really that sort of weak-minded? Is that conscious? I think, oh God, this is terrible. But I do worry that there are a lot of well-meaning people that just aren't. They don't cross a certain threshold of being able to think through the problem.
I think the problem is that that's the real answer to why the schools are so bad, but it is not the answer to how it is recorded in the mind. In other words, we create a phony ideological difference about how to fix the schools that prevents them from being fixed, which results effectively in people with means opting out of public schools, which increases the problem because it means that sabotage of the public schools basically externalizes the problem of educational malpractice onto some populations and not others. And so, anyway, a lot of things look like this, where there's a solution to a problem. We could find it if we agreed that the problem was to be solved, but there's a kind of cryptic sabotage that takes hold because of the kind of competition we are in with each other. You know, we could make the same argument about why there's so much homelessness, right? Why do we not solve the homelessness problem? Well, in part, the homelessness problem is the bottom of a ladder where depressing wages all the way along is a feature, not a bug, right? You depress wages by having people below you, whatever rung you're on, there are always people below you who would be more than happy to take your job, which reduces your bargaining power and trying to negotiate for more. And so, in essence, the homelessness problem is the symptom we can't avoid seeing. It's an outgrowth of a system that is designed to do something it never states. And, you know, there are a lot of these things. And as you know, my sense is if you put good people in power and you give them the opportunity not to have to pander to corrupting influences, these problems aren't so difficult to solve. But if you leave the corrupting influences in a position to veto everything, you'll never get anywhere.
All right, so let's just take one thing and see if we agree on what the problem is. I'll state what I think the solution is, and you punch me in the throat if I'm missing something. Because what I'm about to say, I mean very, very sincerely. But it is also possible that I'm delusional in a way that I just don't see. So my mom works for a school, and she'll occasionally tell me stories about like. And she's not even saying it like she doesn't have a problem with it, but I hear it and I think this is madness. Like the fact that there are teachers in some school districts that they're accused of some pretty insane shit, whether it's just like gross incompetence or potentially doing, things with students that cross a potential sexual line, and they're just shuttled off to a room somewhere where they continue to get paid and receive their benefits because the unions are so strong that it is so hard to get rid of even a horrendous teacher that you can't, it's just better to put them in a room and keep paying them and then slot somebody else into that. Now, as a business person, I can just tell you that is a recipe for disaster. You will have so much money being spent on the dumbest shit ever, and you don't have a way of encouraging. Like, this is an area where you want there to be a hierarchy. You want people, like, if I could, and some universities actually do this, if I could create a hierarchy, a leaderboard, so people could see who are the teachers killing it. The teachers, I don't know what the criteria would be. Fair enough. That's going to be for somebody more invested, but like student ratings, test scores, like outside audit, something where it's like, yo, here are the people that are actually killing the game. And then here are the people that rank lower. For instance, Ray Dalio, largest hedge fund manager in the world, does these things where he has his employees do a forced ranking of, say, managers, and the whole company will rate the managers. And they put it up for everyone to see. And you see who's at the top and who's at the bottom. Ouch, that shit hurts. But like, it inspires you to get better because you don't want to be at the bottom rung, or you say, I want to go work for a company that doesn't do this. But either way, you're getting rid of the people at the bottom and you bring fresh blood in. So my thing is, look, you cannot be in a situation where either, and I don't know if it's school vouchers or what it's going to be, But if a school is underperforming, either the people, teaching, administrators, whatever, they've got to go, or the union's got to go. Something's got to give so that like real talent can rise. Why am I wrong?
You're not wrong, except that you're trying to save a system that's probably beyond help, right?
Go on.
So, look, the incentives have to line up. That's the thing. If you're going to pay people to sit in a room because they've misbehaved or because they're terrible at their job, then obviously you're going to accumulate some, just parasitic class of people in the system who are just going to draw a paycheck for nothing. That's not a viable plan. On the other hand, there's a reason that schools are terrible that has a lot to do with the fact that somehow we have allowed the market to set the wages of the teachers, when in fact we ought to be subsidizing this so that great people want to do it, and maybe not permanently. So if I was to try to fix the system, I would probably try to encourage people to spend a period of time teaching to discover, if they were really good at it, but also to attract people who were really good at something else. In other words, being really good as a teacher is partially about knowing something. If you've set your sights on being a teacher rather than knowing something worth teaching, then you're probably off track. So we should want to attract people who are really good at, math, physics, art, whatever it is, so that they have a passion coming in. And the problem is the way the system is structured, we don't attract very many people who have a passion. And frankly, those few who come in there do so doing themselves massive economic harm, right? Their passion drives them to just effectively sideline themselves from the market in order to do this passion. And then what do? Is we hobble them with curriculum that's just absolutely authoritarian and draconian, which leaves them almost no freedom to engage this passion. So we drive out the good ones. This is not a stable system, and it misunderstands the purpose of education, right? The purpose of education should be to upgrade the mind so it's maximally capable. And the way to do that is to figure out who knows something, has a passion for conveying it, and how do we bring them on board and give them the freedom to figure out how to convey it? One of the things that was true about Evergreen, which it's just killing Heather and me that we can't manage to convey the importance of this to people, is that we had total freedom to teach however we wanted, teach whatever material we wanted. Now, lots of people abuse that freedom. You don't want those people. You want to figure out how to eliminate them quickly. But for anybody who actually has a passion to figure out what can be conveyed, having a blank canvas is magic. So you want the freedom to use it, and you want a system that gets rid of people who will abuse it. And if you can do those two things, then you'll end up having a marvelous educational system, far better than what you would get if you just simply tried to rescue this one by getting rid of the worst teachers. I've done a lot of thinking about the West, and I think of myself as a patriot of the United States, but even more so a patriot of the West. And I believe that although the antecedents of the West can be traced back all the way to ancient Greece, that the West was really founded by the American founding fathers, and it was founded almost by accident. That in order to get the colonies to confederate, they built a system that leveled playing fields in a way that hadn't been done before. And I don't think they knew what problem they actually solved. And I don't mean to take anything away from them. I'm a huge fan of the founding fathers, and I think they did as well as they could possibly have done from their place in history.
What did they think they were doing, and what did they actually do?
Well, I mean, consent of the governed is a radical idea. And, there are, again, antecedents of it. But the idea that you're going to have broad scale voting to figure out the direction of a society is a radical departure. But once you decide that that may be a better way of navigating, getting people to agree to it because they do not see the fix as being in, that's the trick. The idea of the West is that we shouldn't, it's basically a an application of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance before it existed. So you should want to make rules that you'd be as happy to live on the other side of, right? Your desire for a rule should not be contingent on your position in society. We should want courts that can adjudicate questions of fact and questions of law without asking who that law is being applied to. It shouldn't matter. That's what they did. And in building that system, they actually solved an evolutionary puzzle before anybody knew what an evolutionary puzzle was. So we evolutionists have done a poor job of exploring what I call lineage. We have proper language, and have since mid-20th century, for understanding how kin relationships affect behavior. Right? We understand why a mother may run into a burning building to save her offspring, because that offspring is the conduit through which her genes will reach the future. But we evolutionists lost track of the fact that the logic that explains that when it's your offspring or your cousin continues to explain that at much larger scales for which we don't have precise terminology that says exactly how many genes are shared. A lineage is an evolutionary entity. Lineages carry our genes through time, and by acting in ways that benefit our lineage at the expense of other lineages, we can advance our genetic interests.
Why do you avoid the word race?
For a very particular reason. Lineage is the responsible version of the concept. Race is a racist bastardization of the legitimate concept, right? The idea that you switch categories based on one drop of blood from some other group, that is a self-serving racist notion. And so by saying lineage, I'm telling you what level of rigor I'm demanding from the concept.
Is America one lineage?
No, absolutely not. In fact, that's the amazing thing about it.
Okay, so where, if it isn't, the one drop thing just feels like gray area to an otherwise serviceable concept of race. But if it isn't breaking along race and it isn't breaking along nation, what is a lineage?
Well, no. Lineages are the rigorous version of what we sloppily call race. Now, I can define it precisely, and you can extrapolate from it. A lineage is any individual and all of their descendants. Okay? Now, what will not be immediately obvious is that becomes an absolute power tool of a concept because it is scale independent. If you have no children, you are a lineage. You and all of your children and grandchildren, if you have them, are a lineage. But so too is your species, a lineage. There was a most recent common ancestor and all of its descendants. That's a lineage. Mammalia is a lineage. The idea that these things are in play evolutionarily is very important. It has profound implications. The idea that the way the dynamics in a room play out based on the lineage relationships that are represented there is only something you can comprehend if you've looked at that fractal and you realize that the Frenchman and the Irishman may view each other as competing lineages until the Japanese person walks through the door, right? That these dynamics play out in ways we're all familiar with, and we don't understand that we're looking at an evolutionary story. But back to the founders. In order to confederate the states, the founders built a crude set of level playing fields. Now, they weren't perfectly level, and there were some major flaws in those formulations. But nonetheless, what they had to do to get the signatories to agree was figure out how to level them enough that people's fears were put to rest. But here's where the rubber meets the road on this one. There are two evolutionary bases for cooperation. One of them is genes, shared genes. that's what is flowing through lineages. And that is why lineages more naturally collaborate against other lineages than at random. But there's another basis, which is reciprocal altruism. Reciprocity can take two individuals that look very different and cause them to collaborate because it's profitable to do so. And this is, if you squint at it correctly, the reason that an orchid flower and a hummingbird collaborate, right? Those are very distinct lineages. I mean, one's an animal and one's a plant. That's pretty widely separated. They collaborate not because of their shared genes, of which they do have some. They collaborate because it is profitable for each of them to do so. Now, in leveling the playing fields, the founders created an environment in which people who did come from many different lineages had a basis for collaborating with other individuals irrespective of their lineage background, irrespective of race. Now that is lightning in a bottle. And the reason that it's lightning in a bottle is that if you imagine that there's a lot of productivity to be discovered through collaboration, well, if you decide only to collaborate with people who look like you, how far you're going to get is going to be limited because some of the best people to collaborate probably don't look like you. So to the extent that you build a system in which people collaborate with whoever else brings the right stuff to the table, you do a lot better. And all of the amazing list of innovations that are American in origin, I believe is downstream of this very thing, that the founders created an environment in which people collaborated with others. Now, did they tell, racial jokes behind each other's backs? Yeah, they did. They mocked each other and mimicked each other's accents and all of that stuff. But the point is, at the end of the day, there was an awful lot of collaboration that was indifferent to what you look like and who your ancestors were. And once other populations saw how productive that was, they wanted in. So it was a contagious idea. This is why the West is bigger than the United States, is that there's just no argument for behaving in another way once you've seen how good this is in good times. But the problem is, it only works when you are in a period of growth, and we have been in an amazing period of growth. When the growth runs out, blood is thicker than water, and what happens is we go back to our corners, and that's what's happening now. That's why the West is collapsing. That's why our blindness to where we are is going to result in a massive loss for all of humanity, is that it is not going to allow us to avoid that pitfall. We're going to go back to doing what we have done. Genocide is going to become more common and more unavoidable. And anybody who sees that connection would do virtually anything to prevent it from happening because it's such a terrible loss to humanity.
We seem to be doing the exact opposite, though. It's very much under attack. Like, even if you widen that definition out and say that part of the way that we collaborate beyond lineage is through specialization. So you're good at a thing and we're both going to use reason in order to get us where we want to go. So the scientific method. You've talked really interestingly about people need to deal with the physical world. You can't do everything at a social, intellectual level. Go make a car run. Like, nobody has to tell you whether it worked or not. Either the car turned on and it runs or it didn't. And having that kind of very tactile relationship with something either works or it doesn't becomes really, really important. So we are living in a time where that very process of rationality is being hand-waved away as somehow white supremacist or whatever, which is crazy town to me. So how do we protect this little ember? So if we're right now stopping people from talking about things, censoring people to death. In fact, one thing I'd love to hear you talk about is Don Lemon and Elon Musk, and Elon saying, you want censorship so badly you can taste it. I thought that was a great line and really endemic of something far more than just Don Lemon. I think a lot of people want to moderate and make sure that some things just can't be talked about. So anyway, how do we protect that little flame when it is under assault from so many different directions?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's what we've been getting at for this whole discussion. I may be wrong about how we protect it, but in my opinion, the thing to do is to understand it, to understand what it's doing for us, to understand what the likelihood is of whatever replaces the system exceeding it in this capability. I think the chances are almost nil. If you destroyed this system, what will replace it, it will look a lot like history, and it will be a lot worse, which is not to say that we should ignore any of the glaring defects of our system, but we should at least compare it to something other than phony utopian alternatives that have never been established to be possible. So anyway, I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to explain why we've got it pretty good, why addressing the flaws of our system will always be better than scrapping it in favor of some system that hasn't shown any promise in accomplishing what we've got. And I think also exploring, why history looked the way it did, right? There is a reason to talk about Hitler. And my term for Hitler is rational monster, right? I don't diminish the horror of what he did, obviously. In fact, I'm more familiar with it than most. But understanding why that would have happened, if you imagine, the reason I engaged in that exploration when I was a college student was I was afraid that it was just too easy to dismiss him as nuts. If you dismiss Hitler as nuts, well, then there is nothing to be done to prevent the next one, right? You can't prevent radical dysfunction. Somebody's going to be radically dysfunctional. If that's it, it's just, there's nothing to be said. On the other hand, a rational monster can be disincentivized from doing what they do. You can prevent Hitler from emerging by making it irrational to do what he did.
How do we decide who's an irrational monster?
We don't have to. We don't have to. Okay, so this is actually bringing back a bunch of threads. Let's take the case of rape, right? And let's remember that the reason that rape is on the table here as a topic is that it's the shallow end of the pool with respect to how knowledge helps us prevent something that all reasonable people agree is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
A rapist can pass their genes into the future by raping. Civilization can prevent men from doing this by driving the cost up so high that it's not worth it, that the profit that can be made by doing this is small or negative. But even more importantly, let's just notice that rape is essentially impossible for many men to commit. And the reason is because it's not a turn on, right? In order to rape, you have to be turned on by the process. So why is it that so many men are really incapable of it? Is that genetic difference? No. It's a developmental difference. We have the power to make rape disgusting. And if we do make rape disgusting, then it becomes vanishingly rare by virtue of the fact that it's just off the table for most of the people who are physically equipped to do it. That is an important leverage point. We, as a society, ought to hold values that cause us to raise boys in such a way that rape is disgusting to them by the time they become adults. And that's readily possible. So if you didn't have the discussion, if you said, well, look, I don't want to hear any discussion of why rape happens because you're going to legitimize it, then you never get to the point of realizing, oh, well, actually, we have a tool at our disposal. It's not a simple one. It's not, you can't snap your fingers and make it go away, but you can say, well, 3 generations from now, would we like rape to be a historical consideration and not a modern consideration? Of course you would, right? The leverage point exists in understanding it, but you have to have the courage to get to the end of the book before you realize that you have that tool at your disposal. Now, the question is, rape is loosely analogous to genocide. Rape is the individual version. Genocide is the lineage level version. Do we have a tool that takes genocide off the table if we are capable of understanding why the idea keeps reemerging? Right? We said never again after the Holocaust, but how many genocides have we seen since? never again didn't work. So if you really believe in never again, then the question is, well, what tool gets us to never again? And I would argue that I don't know what the tool is, but I will tell you the most likely place to find it is with an unflinching investigation of genocides, their causes, and any instances in which they've been averted through wisdom or the altering of incentives or whatever it may be. So why am I going down that road? Is it because there's something perverse about me? Am I fascinated by despicable historical patterns? No, I'm terrified by them, and that's why. I really think the route to preventing them comes in understanding them.
Interesting that we have to. So you're spreading the meme through the layer of culture. You're saying we have to bake into culture that this is just absolutely abhorrent. I think what people are going to, well, people may or may not hear, but as you were saying it, this was the first thing that I thought, is that this idea ends up becoming so identified with being disgusting that it trips the disgust filter, which then makes people want you to stop talking about it. And so there's a potential fascinating oscillating loop of people force other people to stop talking about it so much that it becomes so taboo that suddenly it has to be reinforced. It's possible that we're living through a moment like that with certain things, though I'm either old school, but rape is still pretty disgust triggering for me.
Yeah.
Does not feel like that needs reinforcing.
Wait.
Yep.
I think we're missing something though, because I mean, I'm not into porn. I think porn is a terrible error. I'm not against erotica. It's not that erotic content throws me, but
interesting. You have a line though.
Oh,
erotica fine, porn bad.
Yes, porn apocalyptically bad.
Can you draw a line?
I can. I can't operationalize the line, but I can tell you exactly where the line is.
Okay.
The line is, was the motivation for the production of the content profit?
Interesting. Okay.
You could make great art and get paid for it. In fact, I think you aspire to this.
Yes.
So the fact that you get paid for it, the fact that you did profit doesn't tell us whether that's what drove you to make it.
Right.
But if the thing that drove you to make it is profit and it's erotic in nature, that's pornography.
Interesting.
Which isn't to say that every item in porn is
so
harmful.
Hold on.
Yeah.
If I make hardcore bondage, super dominant, aggressive, almost rape-like porn, but I'm not doing it for money, I just think it's beautiful art. Sincerely.
Yep. No, I get it.
That would be okay?
Well, it's okay. The line I'm drawing, my feeling is a wise person, and unfortunately young people are never wise. They can be wise beyond their years, but they're not wise because there's no way for them to be that. But for a young person, I would say you draw this line in an absolute fashion. You do not let anything that is likely to be pornography, right? Maybe you don't know for sure why they made it, but if you think that somebody made that thing for profit, you do not let that into your sexual mind. It's terrible for you and it's terrible for your future partner.
That seems like a really weird line to draw with the profit thing. I would, so just as one guy speaking from experience, the loop I would worry about is volume, initial age of contact, given how brains develop, and then the type. So if it were like super vanilla, it's, like wedding night, missionary, like really simple, loving, awkward, I'm less concerned. If it's an ever escalating loop of like freak show that starts at age 11, now I'm very worried about what they will imbue. But even if that shit was art from top to bottom and the person making it was just like, I just want to give to the world, I'd still be like, don't do it.
Well, look, I'm not arguing that everything that would fall under the category of erotica is inherently defensible, just as I believe in free speech, but I don't believe that you should say everything. I believe, you should choose very carefully what to say, and most speech is probably bad, even though you should be entitled to make any argument you want. But let's look at the case. You've drawn a continuum between plain vanilla stuff that's erotic for the most basic human reasons up through super extreme stuff. Here's my point about the profit motive. The profit motive inherently drives you towards the end of the continuum that you instinctively are repelled by. And the reason for that is because all pornographers are selling the same thing, sex. So how do you compete in a world where all of your competitors have the same thing for sale? And the answer is through an escalating battle over extremeness that inevitably, eventually goes to taboo. Now, I believe that those taboos, presumably all of them, evolved for a reason. Those reasons may not be things that we understand, or in some cases we might understand them. But the idea that because you can sell people something, because they haven't seen it before, because it's taboo, that you should do that, that's insane, right? Those taboos, this is a Chesterton's fence issue. You don't know why something has been off limits. But the fact that the market will drive people to explore it tells you that motive is suspect. And so anyway, again, I'm not telling you I know how to operationalize the line between porn for profit and erotica that's made for other reasons. And I'm not telling you that all erotica is good, but I am telling you there's no defense necessary for human beings producing sexual content or gravitating to it. I mean, I do look at, marvelous sculptures of naked women, and I wonder, is that the porn of the day, right? And is the fact that I'm looking at such a sculpture in a museum and that I appear to be, engaged in an elevated activity rather than, a base activity? Is that the distortion of history and the fact that our civilization has grown so crass that we miss what's going on? And I don't know the answer to the question, but human beings make erotica. They always have, and there's nothing wrong with it. And I would argue against anybody who said that we shouldn't, because I don't know what role it has played. But pornography for profit is dangerous precisely because it leads in the direction of exploring realms that are bad, most especially violence. This is one of the things that I don't think this is an abstract discussion at all. If you want to see rape eliminated, then the one thing we mustn't do is eroticize it, which is what we're doing, because the market can't help but explore that niche. So, I mean, I think this is a great test case, right? Does it make sense to explore all of these things that people don't want talked about? Well, I don't know. I feel like I just presented, I'm not saying that we will embrace it, but I feel like I've just presented a map for how, if society decided it was serious about eliminating the scourge of rape, it would go about doing it. Not eroticizing rape would be a great start, because to the extent that rape is not erotic, it becomes near impossible. And I believe the same thing is true for genocide. It's just a more complicated puzzle. So, and to go back to an earlier point, I don't think anybody out there has a valid argument that says you will not find the solution to those puzzles by understanding them. I think that argument is suspect on its face. I think we are likely to find the solutions to these puzzles by understanding the puzzles. And if we don't, the likelihood that we will make them worse, I think, is vanishingly small.
Elon Musk has said multiple times, and I actually think he's right, if you want racism to go away, you have to stop talking about it all the time. That flies in the face of what you're saying right now, which is we need to talk about it, make it taboo, keep it in a certain box.
No. I would instantiate the principle that I'm elucidating differently. And in fact, this is why I thought the question of IQ is another good test case. what do we find if we actually go down that road? Well, I don't think most people are ready for it, but I think if we did go down that road, what we would find actually, it didn't have to be a good answer, but I believe it is a good answer.
When you say it's a good answer, so here's what I imagine happens, and I do want to get back to the context we started this in, which is what is happening to Western civilization. But just to take the IQ thing so it doesn't keep coming back up, I think there are two hyper dangerous things that, if solidified, can create real problems. Whatever's true is true. I think the truth is an absolute defense. I am not saying people should not look at this. I'm just saying I get why you're not going to find me running to have this conversation. If you find that Jews really do have a higher IQ, that's not going to go good. Like, people are going to have a real fucking hard time with that. That is going to be weaponized.
Yep.
And if you find that Black people have a slightly lower IQ, then that is going to be weaponized. And both of those things are horrific, and there's no good that comes out of it. Now, again, the truth is an absolute defense. Whatever's true is true. But goddamn, like, those are the landmines that people are trying to avoid. And given that I think ideas really do run the things, they run the cultural currents, that there are some ideas I just don't want to spend a lot of time with.
I get it, but I think, and I get it really well, because I do think that if the truth were as simple as what you just outlined, and the implication were the one that you didn't state but was carried in what you said, that would be a disaster for humanity. And it's possible. I'm not interested in that answer. I'm relieved that I don't believe it's true. But here's the thing that was missing from your description, your hypothetical description of a bad answer that would do harm to humans to explore it. To say that IQs differ between populations is almost certainly true, and substantially so.
Sure.
That is not what most people hear when they hear a claim like that, is that must mean that the genes produce those differences. That's not what it means. And the difference between distinctions in cognitive capacity that are the result of genetic differences between populations and the significant distinctions in cognitive capacity that are the result of things that are developmental is all the difference in the world. All right? If you knew that there were important distinctions between populations, but that those distinctions were not based in genes, then the answer is, well, can we level everybody up? Is part of the game the reason that people are blinding each other about keeping your competitors in the dark? This is obviously an undercurrent for the cryptic warfare between populations. And so my feeling is, look, I don't believe, here's what I think people imagine, and here's what I think underlies the hypothetical you put on the table. People look at sport and they think they know what must be going on with the brain, right? Because it seems like it should be analogous, right? We all understand that the capacity to engage in different sports is not evenly distributed between populations. It's radically unevenly distributed. And somebody who hasn't thought deeply about this may say, well, seems like there should be every analogy between cognitive capacity and physical capacity. And so I think we know the truth about the differences between races because we've seen it, on the basketball court and the hockey rink and the long jump pit and all of that. It's a bad analogy. And the reason it's a bad analogy is that there's a very good reason that human populations radically differ in their athletic capability across different sports. There's a very good reason, and it's because they came from different habitats. So you find Ethiopians are absolutely dominant in marathon running. Why? Oh, because Ethiopia is really frickin' hot. And the key skill, if you're an Ethiopian at a physiological level, is the shedding of excess heat, right? The ability to build up too much heat is lethal. And so they become lanky and lean, right? They are shaped in such a way that maximizes their surface area to volume ratio so they can shed heat. It's the exact inverse of what an Inuit has. Why are Inuits round? Well, Inuits are round because it's freaking cold, and you want to shed as little heat as possible. So you want to minimize the surface to volume ratio if you're an Inuit. And so why are the Inuits not dominating marathon running? Because they come from the Arctic. So the reason that humans differ across all of these physical capabilities is that different habitats select for different things. You would expect them to differ because is it better to be round or lanky? Well, tell me where we're going to compete and I'll tell you which, right? There is no better. It's all about adaptation to particular habitats. This is not true cognitively. There's no habitat that selects for stupidity. What's more, the ability for genes to alter your physical structure, right? The ratio of one bone to another is tremendous. But that's not how the mind forms. There aren't enough genes to build a mind by blueprint. The mind is the result of a very basic process that is set in motion that then is exposed to all of these developmental influences. So here's the bitter pill of IQ. Populations differ in their cognitive capacity as adults. That does not say that those differences came from the genome. And here's another bitter pill. There have to have been, in evolutionary history, significant differences in cognitive capacity between populations that did come from the genome. In order for our brains to have gotten as large as they did, those with more capacity had to have outcompeted those with less capacity. So that did happen. It is possible. But the question that we are left with, the one that we are avoiding because of what we see on the basketball court and because of what we see, on the soccer field, the question that we are avoiding is what would you have to do to democratize the things that make us smarter? My feeling is every population is undershooting the mark substantially, right? We have not properly studied the question of what developmental environment actually makes you smarter, right? And we are not doing well. I think it could be done much better, and you would find every single population on Earth would rise radically if we actually put kids in an environment that brought the best out of their capabilities. But what I don't see is a substantial reason to think that within a species with lots of interbreeding, that we have these genetically based cognitive differences that reside in one population and not another. It doesn't make sense that they would. So, what was that? 8 minutes? 8 minutes. And what I've said is there is a very strong chance that by avoiding the question of how cognitive capacity is distributed by lineage, that you are avoiding the remedy that might make us all radically smarter and neutralize the differences. Do we really want to avoid that question? I think the solution lies down the road of understanding what the distinctions are. And frankly, I think we all believe in the distinctions. Why would anybody fight for better schools if the quality of your developmental environment didn't have an influence on how smart you ended up?
I think there's a lot of assumptions in the things that you're saying. I'm not familiar with the literature. I have certainly heard that intelligence is inheritable to a hyper distressing degree. Now, across lineages, I have no idea. I think I made my reasons for not even wanting to look at it pretty clear, so I'll leave that alone. But yeah, I think you've explained it perfectly. It unfortunately brings me back full circle to, but the moment we're in now in the West is, despite all the incredible things that it has rained upon us, the absolute just embarrassment of riches that it is to be born into the Western democratic world, now people are tearing it apart. I saw a video the other day where the guy was like, I'm at this march because I want to end America. And he was like, all of us do. And I was like, what? So you've got at the ground level, people are trying to tear the West apart. You've got just absolute weird things happening at the government level, clearly power grabs. You've got censorship going on left, right, and center. Given how much ground we've just traversed, can you put a button on why blind us? Why are they so worried about what we see and say?
Yeah, let me flesh out the concept I started with, and then let me...
as long as the punchline is why they are doing this, I'm here for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem is who are they and how specific can we be about why they're doing it? But if we put those nuances aside, and then I will return to the question of where there might be hope, given all of the reasons that you've just outlined for despair. I've come up with a concept called the time-traveling money printer. And the time-traveling money printer is based on the idea that we all have been through the thought exercise of what would you do if you had a time machine, right? And well, if you had a time machine that could go forward in time, you could go figure out what's going to happen, and you could come back to the present and place your bets in the market and make tons of money, right? If you had a time machine that went backwards, you could go back and you could buy Apple and Microsoft and Amazon, make tons of money. So we all get that a time machine is a moneymaker. But there are no time machines as far as we know. I'm concerned that some rent-seeking elites have...
Rent-seeking, for those that don't know, because I always have to look this up, is people that manipulate the political system to their personal gain.
I would describe it differently. I would say it's people who make a profit through activity that is not productive.
The dictionary disagrees with you.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be willing to hash this out in a fight to the death with the dictionary. But in any case, let's imagine that we have some folks who have got some unearned power, who wish to have more power and control and don't wish to be upended by competitors who are more clever than they are, something like that. Well, they don't have a time machine, but what they do have is enough control to render the truth-seeking capability of humanity lame. They have the ability to pollute what we are able to deduce. And therefore, if they can privatize the knowledge of what is coming, it is like they have a time machine, right? Let's take an example. Strong evidence suggests that the COVID pandemic, whatever its nature, was already happening in China in September, October of 2019. And that elites knew this. Did they immediately run to the public and tell us? Or did they make some phone calls and say, here's what's coming down the pike? Cruise ships are a bad bet. You should short, the cruise ship industry, airlines. I would go big on home deliveries of this, that, and the other. So you can just imagine it's as good as a time machine if you privately hold the information about what history is about to do and the public is unaware of it. The opportunity to make money is limitless. So that's a why somebody would have engaged in blinding us, because the blinder we are, the more powerful their money printer is. And I believe that this happened. And actually, there's a tremendous amount of evidence. Much of it is laid out in Bobby Kennedy's book on Wuhan, that there were incredibly prescient investments made by Bill Gates and others in companies that you would have no reason to think were about to have a spectacular rise, that just so happened to have the goods for producing mRNA vaccines that would just so happen to take over the world, this sort of thing. So anyway, I don't know exactly who. We know some of the players. Gates appears to be an important player who seems to know what's going to happen in the future before the rest of us do. And why is obvious, because for the same reason that people rob a bank, this is safer and much more lucrative to place bets in the world based on private information. It's it's a good gig. And so anyway, that's what I think is happening. We're being systematically blinded because there are some people who are sophisticated in their own diabolical way who think, well, why the hell would I share useful information about reality if I could use it to my own advantage instead?
What do you think about somebody like Don Lemon, who really does seem to want to censor? He's not, I really don't think he's doing it because he's going to make some prescient bets and he wants to keep everybody dumb. I think he represents the person who's like, yeah, you've tripped a moral thing in him that probably plays out something like somebody needs to be the adult in the room. The thing that he kept saying in the interview with Elon Musk was, you need to moderate this hate speech. Like, hate speech has gone up. What are you doing? You need to take this stuff off your platform. And no matter how many times Elon said, if it doesn't violate the law or our policies, we don't take it down. We just don't promote it. And he just kept going. You need to moderate this stuff. What do you think about that? Is moderation propaganda for censorship, as Elon says, or is it the flagrant embrace of hate speech that Don Lemon sees it as?
Well, I know very little about Don Lemon, except that the 6 times he has risen to my awareness, he's been impressively foolish. So I don't know what that is. I don't know that he's organic or not organic. I don't know what his role in the universe is. But let's put it this way. You've got a vacuum of comprehension based on the sabotage of our educational institutions. So people are dumber.
Intentional sabotage?
I don't know. I assume the same. Think about it this way. An institution that makes other people's kids smarter would be viewed hostilely by ruthless players who wished to take every advantage they have and parlay it into wealth and power. So I don't think it's an accident that our universities are completely incapable of figuring out whether 2 + 2 = 4 or whether men can become women. That confusion is serving somebody. At what level? Was this a bunch of industries that decided that they needed to disrupt the discovery of inconvenient things? Was it more systematic than that? I can't say. I think there probably is a certain amount of systematic sabotage, but how would I know? But in any case, in a world where you just don't have those truth-seeking mechanisms, they don't work. In fact, they are more likely to spit out the inverse of the truth than truth itself. There's an awful lot of room for various bad thought processes to take over. And one of the things that you should absolutely expect is that where our forefathers have discovered a counterintuitive truth, it's going to get uninvented. Free speech, it's not obvious. Most speech is probably pointless. And of the speech that has an impact, a huge fraction of it is just bad. So, of course, somebody with a childlike view of the universe would think, well, why don't we just get rid of the bad speech? And certainly there are some things that are so obviously bad speech. Let's just start with that, right? But as soon as you get there, you realize, oh, somebody's going to have to draw a line, and they're going to come up with all kinds of utilitarian reasons that they have to draw the line farther and farther and farther. And so the point is, no, actually, you can't do any of that. Don't do any of that, because if you step on that slippery slope, it's a disaster. So it's counterintuitive. Likewise, the standard and burden of proof in a court is also counterintuitive. Most of the people that we charge with a crime are probably guilty. So why would we force the state to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt? Why wouldn't we just say, well, if the evidence suggests that the person committed the crime, they probably did, and, how often is that going to go wrong? No. Founders, they had a counterintuitive understanding, which is the power of the state is too ferocious, and that you have to hobble the state in order to give a person a fighting chance, because even if on the average day a person where the evidence points to their having committed the crime probably did. If anything causes the government to take a dim view of political competitors or whatever, the government needs to be hobbled in its capacity to rob you of your freedoms, right? That's counterintuitive. So anyway, my point would be, we have lost sight of all of the things that we used to understand, right? There are men and there are women. We used to understand that. Now it's some crazy battle, right? 2 + 2 = 4. Yep, the symbols are arbitrary, but the concept is not the least bit arbitrary. It doesn't need discussion, right? But it's now up for discussion. Is pedophilia bad? Yeah, we used to know that pedophilia was really bad, and there was no reason to, play devil's advocate over this. And yet, suddenly, this topic is back on the table. So we are losing sight of all the things that we understood, all of the bedrock that civilization is built on. That's in part because the vacuum of understanding and the sabotage of education is opening the door to us just simply dusting off concepts that we had gotten past. But the other thing is that when somebody is advocating for censorship, what probably happened is they find themselves in a temporarily advantaged position, and they would like somebody to hard code the biases that favor them in the moment so that they continue to. And they don't understand that they are very likely to end up on the wrong end of those very same principles, and therefore the wise position is, no, we don't do that. We don't do that. It means you're going to have to tolerate some bad speech.
To learn more about these complex topics, check out this episode with the one and only Jordan Peterson.
Look how much I love my son. He doesn't even have a penis anymore. Those women online displaying themselves, they're not human. You're a fool if you think that's human. And Jews, they have IQs that are probably 15 points higher than the typical. So they're radically